The heat pressed down on the town like a living weight. Dust rose under every boot. A crowd gathered around the wooden platform in the center of Main Street. A woman stood alone on it, wrists bound, bare feet on rough boards, chin lifted high. The rope hung below her. Auction numbers climbed through the thick air. 50, 60, 100. Then a voice cut through from the back of the crowd. Low, steady, unhurried, every head turned. A man stepped out of the shadows, a leather pouch in his hand. Coins dropped one by one onto the wood. The rope was cut. The heat came first, before the noise, before the crowd. Pressed down on ironwood flats like something, with weight, something that sat on your chest, and made every breath cost extra. The kind of heat that turned men mean by noon, and women silent by evening. There was no shade on Main Street. There never had been. Just packed dirt, and sun-warped boards, and a row of buildings leaning toward each other like they were tired of standing alone. Sanaya stood on the platform in the center of it. Wrists bound, bare feet on rough wood, chin up. She would not look down, because looking down meant looking at the rope. And looking at the rope meant thinking about how it got there. And she had promised herself, somewhere on the long walk from the fort, that she would not think about that. Not here, not in front of them. The crowd had gathered the way crowds gather for a hanging. Curious, restless, a little ashamed of themselves, though most wouldn't have called it that. Men in dust-caked coats, women under bonnets, fanning themselves with folded newspaper, murmuring behind gloved hands. Children who should have been kept home. A man named Bragg stood at the front of the platform, with a ledger under one arm, and a voice built for auctioning cattle. Gentlemen. He mopped his neck with a handkerchief already soaked through. You are looking at a rare opportunity. Sanaya's jaw tightened, just slightly, not enough for them to see. A genuine Apache woman. Bragg's eyes slid, over her the way a buyer's eyes slide, over a horse's teeth. Young, strong. Somewhere in the crowd, a laugh. Ugly and quick. We'll start the bidding at $50. A hand went up, then another. 50 became 60. 60 became 70. The numbers climbed the way numbers climb, when men are competing for something they don't need, just to prove they can have it. Sanaya's mind did the thing it always did now. It went somewhere else, because if she stayed inside her body, inside this moment, she would break. And breaking was the one thing they had not managed to take from her yet. So she went back. Not far, just far enough. The smell of pine smoke. Her mother's hands braiding her hair before dawn. Her father's laugh, low and rare, the kind you had to earn. Gone now. All of it. Which was the thought she had promised not to have. And there it was anyway. 80. A rancher near the front. Broad shoulders. A face like a fist. 90. Someone else. Younger. A smile that didn't belong on a human face. Bragg's grin widened. With every number. Like each dollar fed something in him. $100. Bragg mopped his neck again. Do I hear 110? 110. The younger man again. Lazy. Like the number cost him nothing. A woman near the front leaned toward her husband. Sanaya caught the shape of the words, not the sound. Disgraceful. She couldn't tell if the woman meant the auction or the price. Maybe both. Maybe neither. 120. A new voice. A man in a fine coat, who looked like his hands had never done a day's work, and never would. 150. The fist-faced rancher again. Sharper now. Done losing to a man in a fine coat. Bragg's eyes gleamed. 150 going. Sanaya's knees wanted to buckle. She would not let them. She locked them straight the way her mother had taught her to stand. Through long ceremonies, through cold, through grief. Stand like a tree. Trees don't apologize for growing where they grow. Except a tree doesn't get sold for bored feet in front of a crowd that calls it a bargain. Which was not a thought she needed right now. Which came anyway. The fist-faced man pressed his hat lower, jaw working, hungry to win something, anything, in front of an audience that would remember, who backed down, and who didn't. 150, Bragg said again. Going once. Silence stretched. Sanaya's pulse beat once, twice, 3 times in. That silence, loud enough she was sure the whole crowd could hear it too. Going TW. 200. The voice came from the back. Low, even. It didn't rise to be heard. It didn't need to. The crowd turned. Sanaya turned too, because she couldn't help it. Because something in that voice cut through the noise the way a knife cuts, through canvas, clean, without effort, without apology. A man stood apart from the others, tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that wasn't for show, a hat pulled low, a coat that had seen better winters. He didn't look like a man enjoying himself. He looked like a man finishing a chore he didn't want, but wouldn't leave undone. Bragg blinked. $200. A pause, recalculating something behind his eyes. Well now, that's a serious bid, Mr. Hollis. Hollis. The name did something to the crowd. A few men shifted their weight. One woman leaned to whisper to her husband, who did not whisper back. Sanaya had heard that name before, whispered around the fort by soldiers, who spoke of him the way men speak of whether they respect and don't understand. A rancher who kept to himself, didn't drink, didn't gamble, came to town only when he had to, and left before anyone could ask him why. The broad-shouldered rancher, Voss, someone muttered, that Silas Voss, turned with a scowl carved into his face. You got no use for a woman out there, Hollis. His voice carried an edge sharpened by something older than this moment. What in hell are you playing at? Caleb Hollis said nothing. He just stood there, waiting, the way a fence post waits, the way stone waits. Bragg cleared his throat, sensing the air had changed, and not entirely sure how. $200 going once. Silence. Going twice. Nothing. The gavel, not a gavel, just Bragg's flat hand, came down on the podium. Sold. To Mr. Caleb Hollis. For $200. A ripple moved through the crowd. Confusion mostly. A little disappointment, the way people are disappointed when a show ends sooner than they wanted. Sanaya watched him come. He didn't hurry. He didn't swagger either. He moved through the crowd the way a man moves through weather because he had to, not because he enjoyed it. He didn't look left or right. Didn't acknowledge the stairs crawling over him like flies. When he reached the platform, he stopped in front of Bragg and reached into his coat. Pulled out a small leather pouch. Counted the coins into Bragg's waiting palm. One by one. Slow. Deliberate. Each coin a small, clean sound against the wood. Pleasure doing business, Mr. Hollis. Nothing. He turned to her. And for the first time since the soldiers had dragged her into this town, someone looked at her. Not through her. Not at her body, at her worth, at what she could be made to do. Her. His eyes were gray. Steady. The kind of gray that had seen weather come and weather go and had stopped being surprised by either. He didn't smile. He didn't leer. He didn't do the thing every other man in that crowd had done with his eyes in the last hour. Come on, he said, quiet, like it cost him nothing and everything at once. He didn't reach for her, didn't grab her arm the way the soldiers had. He just waited. Every instinct in her body said run, except there was nowhere to run to. The desert would kill her before nightfall. The soldiers would find her before the desert did. And even if neither of those things happened, there was nothing left to run toward. That was the truth underneath all the other truths. Her village was ash. Her mother was ash. Her father, she stopped that thought before it could finish itself. So she stepped down. He moved aside to let her pass. Fell into step half astride behind her. Not close enough to crowd her. Not far enough to pretend he wasn't responsible for her now. The crowd parted. Reluctantly, someone spat in the dirt near her feet. Someone else muttered a word she didn't need translated. A boy, no older than 10, stared up at her, with the wide, unguarded curiosity children have, before the world teaches them what to be afraid of. His mother yanked him back by the collar, before Sanaya could decide whether the look had been kindness, or just a child's plain wondering. Near the edge of the crowd, An older woman in a faded gray dress stood apart from the others, not jeering, not whispering, just watching. When Sanaya's eyes passed over her, the woman gave the smallest nod, barely a movement at all, the kind of gesture a person gives when they want you to know something without wanting anyone else to see them give it. Sanaya didn't know what to do with that. Filed it away instead, the way she was learning to file away everything now, evidence later sorted, later understood. Because kindness that had to hide itself wasn't much kindness at all. Except it was something. And she had learned, in the weeks since the soldiers came, not to throw away anything that might be something, however small. She kept walking, chin up, because that was the only thing left that was still hers. At the edge of town, where the road gave up trying to be a road and dissolved into open scrub, Caleb Hollis stopped. He reached into his coat. Sanaya's whole body went rigid, because a hand reaching into a coat had meant one thing every time for weeks now. A weapon, order, a reason to hurt her that didn't need explaining. But it was a knife. Small, folded. Hold still, he said. She didn't. Not at first. Every muscle screamed to pull away. He didn't grab her to keep her still. He just waited again. The same patient waiting from the platform. So she held still. He stepped behind her. Cut the rope in one motion, clean, practiced. The tension released all at once, and her hands dropped to her sides, raw where the fiber had bitten in, aching in a way that made her eyes sting, though she refused to let them. She turned to face him. Disbelief must have shown on her face, because something flickered across his, gone before she could name it. He folded the knife, put it away, reached for the canteen hanging from his saddle. Water. She didn't move. You're thirsty. Flat. Not a question. Take it. She took it, because her body wanted it more than her pride wanted to refuse it. The water was warm, from the sun on the leather, and it was the first clean thing she'd tasted in longer than she could count. She handed it back when she was done. He clipped it to the saddle without a word. Then he looked at her, and something in his posture shifted, like he was setting something down that he'd been carrying. You're free to go. She stared at him. What? You heard me. Free. I'm not holding you. She looked around. The road behind them leading back to a town that had just watched her get sold like livestock. The land ahead, empty in every direction, hard and unforgiving, and offering nothing but distance. Where? She said. Not really a question. More like the word itself was the only answer she had. His jaw tightened, just slightly. Wherever you want. My people are gone. The words came out sharper than she meant. The soldiers scattered what the sickness and the guns didn't already take. There's nowhere left to want. He didn't answer right away. He looked at the horizon like it might have something to offer him. Didn't. Then stay, he said finally. She blinked. What? Stay. At my ranch. A pause, like he was deciding how much to say, and settling on less rather than more. Work if you want. Leave if you don't. You don't have to decide right now. She studied him, looking for the lie underneath it, the angle, the price that would come due later the way it always did. She didn't find one. Just a man who looked as tired as she felt, in a way that had nothing to do with the heat. Why? She asked. He met her eyes. Because I didn't buy you to own you. The silence after that was heavier than the one before it. She didn't believe him. Not yet. But she had nowhere else to put her feet. How far? She asked. Is your ranch? 5 miles. She nodded slowly. I'll walk it. Something almost moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Close enough to notice. Suit yourself. He swung up into the saddle. Didn't offer her a hand up. Didn't insist she ride behind him. Just turned the horse toward open land and started moving. She followed, because that was easier than deciding anything else. 5 miles took longer than 5 miles should. Her feet were already ruined, blistered, cut, exhausted past the point where pain meant anything specific anymore. But she didn't ask him to stop, and he didn't offer. He rode ahead, close enough to see, far enough that it didn't feel like being watched. The land around them didn't pretend to be gentle. Dry earth, scrub brush clawing up out of cracked ground. The occasional skeleton of a tree, dead so long it had gone silver. There was something almost honest about it, Sanaya thought. The desert didn't lie to you about what it was, which was more than she could say for most of the people she'd met, since the soldiers came. The soldiers, she hadn't let herself think the whole memory through since it happened. Not once, not all the way to the end. She let it in now, walking behind a stranger's horse in a stranger's land, because there was nothing else to do with her feet except walk, and nothing else to do with her mind except remember. It had been early. That was the part that stayed with her most, how early, how ordinary the morning had been, before it wasn't. Smoke rising thin and blue from the cook fires. Her mother grinding corn, humming something without words, the way she did every morning of Sanaya's whole life. Then the dogs started. Not barking, something worse. A low, continuous sound the kind dogs make when they know before the people do. Her father was already moving before the first shot. That was the thing about her father. Some part of him was always listening for the sound the rest of the world hadn't started making yet. He grabbed her by the shoulders, spoke fast, low, the words landing so hard they'd never left her. Run to the rocks. Don't stop for anyone. Not for me. She had stopped for him anyway, just once. Long enough to see him turn back toward the camp, toward her mother, toward the smoke that was starting to rise the wrong color now, thick and black instead of thin and blue. She never saw him again. She'd told Caleb, back at the auction, that her people had scattered like ash. That wasn't quite true. Ash doesn't run. Ash doesn't hide behind rocks for 2 days with no water, listening to gunfire get farther away, and then closer again, and then farther, unable to tell which sound meant safety and which meant the end of everything. Ash doesn't survive by accident, and then spend the rest of its life wondering why. She blinked hard against the memory, against the sun, against both at once, because there was no answer to that question. There had never been an answer, just the fact of her own breathing, in and out, stubborn and unasked for, while everyone she loved had stopped. The soldiers found her on the third day, half mad with thirst, past fighting. She didn't remember much of what came after. The fort, the names they gave the people they brought in, easier names, names that didn't require the soldiers to learn how her language actually worked. The long weeks of waiting for something, trial, release, death, anything, while men in uniforms decided what to do with the people they'd made into problems. And then ironwood flats, and a platform, and a rope, and now this, a stranger's horse, a stranger's dust, a stranger's 5 miles of empty road leading toward a life she had no reason to trust and, for reasons she couldn't, yet explain to herself, no better option than to try. By the time the ranch came into view, the sun had started its long fall toward the horizon, painting everything the color of a wound. The house was simple, rough-hewn wood, stone at the base where it met the ground, a barn that had clearly seen better years than this one, a corral holding 3 horses, a well near the door. It wasn't much, but it looked like it had decided to stay standing and had kept that promise for a long time. Caleb dismounted near the barn. Sanaya stood at the edge of the yard, uncertain, like she was waiting for a wall to appear and tell her where she wasn't allowed. He glanced back. You coming? She hesitated, then nodded. She followed him to the barn, where he unsaddled the horse and rubbed it down without a wasted motion. No wasted words either. When he finished, he turned to her. You hungry? Her stomach answered before her mouth could. He nodded, like that settled something, and led her toward the house. Inside, the place was sparse. Clean, though. A table, a few chairs that didn't match. A stove in the corner, cold for now. Nothing on the walls. No softness anywhere. Just the bones of a life, lived alone, out of necessity rather than choice. He built a fire in the stove, filled a pot from a jug of water, set it to boil, pulled a sack of beans from a cupboard, some dried meat, a few vegetables that had seen better weeks. Not much, he said, almost apologetic. But it'll fill you up. She sat at the table and watched him work. It struck her as strange, a man cooking without complaint, without expecting someone else to do it for him. In her village, this had been women's work, done together, voices overlapping. Here, alone, he did it himself. Quiet, efficient, like everything else about him. When the food was ready, he dished it into 2 tin bowls, set one in front of her, sat across from her with his own. They ate in silence. The food was plain, unseasoned. It was also warm and real, and she hadn't had anything warm and real in longer than she wanted to count. She ate slowly, savoring it, trying not to think about how close she'd come, an hour ago, to never eating a meal like this again. When they finished, he collected the bowls, set them aside, gestured to a narrow door at the back of the room. There's a room back there, small. It's yours if you want it. A beat. I'll sleep out here. She frowned. Why? Because you shouldn't have to sleep on the floor. She didn't know what to do with that, so she just nodded. He opened the door. Tiny room, a narrow bed, a single window, bare, but private. Hers if she chose to believe him. Get some rest, he said. We'll talk in the morning. He turned to leave. Why did you do it? The question stopped him, his back to her. A long silence. Then, quiet. Because someone had to. He left her alone with that. She stood in the doorway a long time, staring at the small bed, the empty room, the strange, unfamiliar shape of a chance she didn't yet understand how to hold. She didn't know if she could trust this man. She didn't know if this was safety or a different kind of cage, one with softer walls. But for the first time in longer than she wanted to remember, she wasn't in chains. Maybe for tonight that was enough. Sleep did not come easy. It never did anymore. She lay on the narrow bed, staring at a ceiling she didn't know, listening to a house that wasn't hers make sounds she didn't recognize. Wood settling, wind finding gaps in the boards, a horse shifting its weight in the barn, somewhere out past the wall. Her body was exhausted. Her mind refused to follow it down, because the moment her eyes closed, the platform came back. The rope, the numbers climbing, faces she didn't know, wearing the same hunger over and over, 100 versions of the same look stacked on top of each other, until they became one face, huge and featureless and endless. She woke gasping, didn't know when she'd fallen asleep, didn't know how long she'd been under. The dark pressed close, unfamiliar, until she remembered where she was, until the shapes in the room resolved into a chair, a window, a door. Her heart wouldn't slow down, so she did the thing her mother taught her when she was small and afraid of storms. Count. Not sheep, nothing so foreign. Just numbers, said slow in the old language, the way her mother's voice used to sound saying them. Tala, Naki, Tagi, 1, 2, 3. Her mother's voice, gone, replaced by her own, thinner, alone in a stranger's house. She must have made some sound, a gasp maybe louder than she meant, because there was a knock at the door. Soft, just once. You all right? Caleb's voice, low, careful, the voice of a man who'd learned, the hard way, not to open a door uninvited. She didn't answer right away. Sanaya. Her name in his mouth. Strange to hear it said by someone who wasn't her mother, wasn't her father, wasn't anyone who'd known her before all of this. Strange and, underneath the strangeness, something almost steadying. I'm fine, she said, which was a lie, which they both understood was a lie, the way lies are understood between two people too tired to argue about them. A pause on the other side of the door. There's water on the table if you need it, he said. I'll be right out here. She heard him settle back into the chair by the cold hearth, heard the small creak of it taking his weight. He didn't come in, didn't ask more than that, didn't try to fix what couldn't be fixed with words through a door. She lay back down, listened to the quiet, and somewhere in that quiet, under the fear, under the grief, that hadn't found its bottom yet, something else took shape. Small, fragile, barely a thing at all. A man was sitting in the dark, on the other side of a door, staying awake so she wouldn't have to be afraid alone. She didn't trust it. Not yet. But she let herself notice it. That was new too. She woke before dawn. Her body ached in places she didn't have names for. Her mind was slow to separate dream from waking. For one long, terrible moment, she didn't know where she was. The walls were wrong. The air smelled wrong. The silence was too complete, too clean. Without the sounds she'd fallen asleep to for weeks. Soldiers' boots. Other prisoners breathing. The creak of wagon wheels. Then it came back. The auction. The man. The ranch. She sat up, bare feet against the cold floor. Through the small window, the sky was just beginning to pale. She could hear movement in the other room. A chair scraping. The soft clink of metal on metal. She opened the door. Caleb was at the stove, heating coffee in a battered pot. He glanced at her but didn't speak. Poured 2 cups. Set one on the table. She approached slowly, still unsure of the rules of this place. The coffee was strong and bitter. Nothing like the teas her mother had made, from bark and root. But it cut through the fog the fort had left behind, sharp enough to remind her she was still, somehow, awake to her own life. "There's bread in the cupboard," he said. "Not fresh, but it'll do." She found it, ate standing, watching him. He didn't ask her anything, just drank his coffee, and looked at the wall like it held something only he could see. Her eyes drifted and caught, there, on his wrist, half hidden by his shirt cuff. Silver. Not new silver. Old. Worked by hand, the kind of hand that pressed a pattern into metal the way her father had, 3 lines crossing, a 4th curving underneath, the mark that meant made with care, not for sale. Her breath caught, because she'd seen that exact pattern 100 times. On her mother's wrist. On her own once before it was taken with everything else. "Where?" she said, and her voice came out strange, too tight. "Did you get that?" Caleb followed her eyes to his own wrist. Something shifted across his face. Confusion first, then something slower, older, working its way up, from somewhere he hadn't visited in a long time. "This?" He turned his wrist over. "A long time ago. Man saved my life. Gave it to me after." "What man?" "I don't." He stopped, frowned. "I never knew his name. I was 18. Lost in a blizzard 2 days north of here, half frozen. Sure I was going to die in the snow like a fool. His people found me, warmed me, fed me, nursed me back, before I could even stand on my own." He looked at the bracelet like he was seeing it for the first time in years. "He put this on me before I left. Never said why." Sanaya's hands had gone still. Too still. Describe him. Tall. Quiet in a way that made you quiet too. Scar through one eyebrow, like a knife had come close and missed. Caleb's voice slowed, memory pulling the words out one at a time. "He had a way of looking at you, like he was deciding whether you were worth the trouble of saving. I never forgot it." The room tilted just slightly just for her, because that was her father, because that scar had come from a bear, not a knife, and he used to let her trace it with her small fingers when she was young enough to ask why, and he would always say the same thing, "Because I was careless once, so you don't have to be." "That was my father," she said. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Caleb went very still. "You're my father." Her voice cracked on the second word, and she hated it, hated that it cracked, hated that after everything this was the thing that finally broke through. "Dakota, that's his name, was..." Caleb stared at her, and she watched something happen behind his eyes, the arithmetic of it, the years folding backward, a debt he hadn't known he was still carrying suddenly arriving at his door. "He saved me," Caleb said, quiet, almost to himself. 15 years ago, maybe more. And yesterday you bought his daughter off an auction block for $200. Her voice shook, not with gratitude, not yet, with something rawer, something that didn't have a clean name. "You didn't know?" "No." His jaw tightened. "I didn't know. Would it have mattered?" The question hung there. He didn't answer right away, and she found herself grateful for that. A man who thought, before he spoke, was a rare enough thing, that she'd learned, painfully, to notice it. "I'd like to think it wouldn't have changed what I did," he said finally. "But I won't lie to you and say it doesn't change something now." Sanaya turned away, walked to the window. The sky outside had gone the color of a fresh bruise, purple bleeding into gray. Because how was she supposed to hold this? A stranger buys her out of chains. And then turns out to be no stranger at all. Turns out to be a debt her father had planted in the world years before she was ever taken. A seed that had grown quietly in a man neither of them knew still existed, until it flowered at the worst and strangest possible moment. "He never told me," she said. "Not to Caleb, to the window, to the sky. He never said he pulled a white man out of the snow. Would you have believed him?" She almost laughed, came out broken instead. "I believed everything he told me." Her throat tightened. "That was the problem. I believed him when he said the soldiers wouldn't come as far as our valley. I believed him when he said the treaty would hold." A pause, and when she spoke again her voice had gone very quiet, very flat, the way voices go when they're keeping something enormous from spilling over. "I believed a lot of things that turned out to be wrong. Caleb didn't try to fix that, didn't offer some clumsy comfort that would have insulted both of them. He just said, 'I'm sorry,' and let it sit there unadorned, the way a man sets down something heavy and doesn't ask you to admire it." She turned back to face him. "This doesn't make us even," she said. "I didn't think it would. I don't know what it makes us." "Neither do I." He looked at the bracelet again, then at her, like he was seeing the shape of a debt he hadn't known was owed, and hadn't known how enormous it was until this exact moment. "But I know I'm not sending you back out that door." Something in her chest, something that had been clenched, since the fort, since the platform, since the moment the soldiers first put rope on her wrists, loosened. Not all the way, not even close, but some. "I'll stay," she said. "For now." He nodded, like that was the only answer he'd expected, and maybe the only one he'd wanted. The next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, Sanaya found him at the table again, turning the bracelet slowly around his wrist, like he was trying to feel his way back, through 15 years to the moment he'd first put it on. She sat across from him without a word. "I keep thinking," he said, not looking up, "about all the ways that day could have gone different. If your father hadn't ridden out that morning. If he'd found me a day later, when the cold would have already finished the job. He would have found you. You don't know that. I do." She said it simply, no argument in it, just certainty. "My father didn't leave things to chance he could control. If he rode out and found you, it's because he was looking. He always said the land tells you when something's wrong on it, if you know how to listen." Caleb turned the bracelet once more, then let his hand fall still. "I owe him a debt I can't ever pay now," he said. "Man's gone. Can't repay a ghost." "You're not repaying a ghost." Sanaya reached across the table, not quite touching his hand, close enough that the gesture meant something anyway. "You're just living the way he'd have wanted a man he saved to live. That's not a debt. That's just decency carried forward." He looked up at her, something working behind his eyes that hadn't fully settled into words yet. "Your father sounds like he was a good man. He was the best man I knew." Her voice caught, just slightly, on the past tense, the way it always did now, a small stumble she doubted she'd ever fully smooth out. "I used to think nobody could measure up to what he was. Strong, steady, never raised his voice, not once, not even when my brothers gave him every reason to. Sounds like he and I would have gotten along. He'd have liked you." She surprised herself saying it, surprised herself believing it, as the words left her mouth. "He didn't trust easy, but when he did, it was for good reason. And you?" She paused, searching for the shape of what she meant. "You don't ask for anything back. That's rare." He would have noticed that. Caleb didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had gone rougher than before. I didn't buy you because of the bracelet, he said. Want you to know that. I didn't know. Wasn't until you saw it that any of this made sense to me. I know. I bought you because a woman was standing on a platform getting sold like a horse, and every man in that crowd was either bidding or looking away, and I couldn't do either one. His jaw tightened. The bracelet just means I was always going to owe your family something. Turns out I just didn't know it yet. Sanaya sat with that. Let it settle into the quiet the way most true things did. In this house, in this new and uncertain life. Then we're square, she said finally. Not because of what he did for you. Because of what you did, not knowing any of it. Doesn't feel square. Doesn't have to feel like anything. A ghost of something almost like warmth crossed her face. It just has to be true. He nodded slowly, and something in his shoulders loosened. Some weight he'd been carrying, since the moment she'd said her father's name, finally set down if not gone. The days that followed took on a shape neither of them planned, but both of them fell into. She woke before the sun most mornings now, the way she had in the village, the way her body had never unlearned it even, after weeks of fort discipline trying to grind it out of her. She fed the chickens without being asked. Swept the porch. Learned where he kept things without him having to tell her twice. He didn't thank her for any of it. Didn't comment. Just moved around her like she'd always been part of the place, which she understood, slowly, was its own kind of respect, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. One morning she found him mending fence near the corral, wood splintered and gray with age. He worked without hurry, pulling broken slats, setting new ones. She picked up a hammer from the ground. Held it out. He looked at it, then at her. You know how to use that? I know how to hit things. Something close to a smile crossed his face, gone almost before it arrived. That'll do. He showed her how to drive a nail straight. How to hold the wood so it wouldn't split. She learned fast, faster than he expected. She could tell by the way his eyebrows moved a fraction, when her third nail went in, as clean as his 10th. They didn't talk much while they worked. They didn't need to. That was new to her. A silence that didn't feel like punishment. Later that week, she showed him something in return. How to read the wind off a hawk's flight. How a shift in birdsong meant weather was coming faster than the sky let on. He listened. Really listened, the way most men in this territory never bothered to, when a woman spoke, let alone a woman who looked like her. My father taught me that, she said, testing the words, testing whether they still hurt to say out loud. He taught me plenty too, Caleb said. Took me years to understand half of it. Which half? The half about debts. He looked at his hands. He never asked me to repay him, never said a word about it before I left his camp. I always wondered if that silence was its own kind of instruction. It was, Sanaya said. He believed a debt spoken aloud stopped being a gift. Caleb nodded slowly, like a door had opened somewhere in him, that had been shut a long time. She caught herself in these small moments, forgetting to keep her guard raised. Forgetting, for a breath or two, that this was still a stranger's house, a stranger's world, a stranger's rules she hadn't agreed to. Then she'd remember, and the guard would come back up. Slower each time, but it came. Because trust wasn't a door you opened once and left open. It was a door you checked over and over to make sure it hadn't been forced. On the third day, Caleb went looking for a heifer that hadn't come back with the rest of the herd. Sanaya went with him, not because he asked, because she'd noticed the tracks near the well that morning, and something in her wouldn't let her keep that knowledge to herself. Not when it might save an animal's life. There, she said, crouching near a patch of churned dirt half a mile out. She went this way, favoring her left front. Caleb frowned down at the ground, squinted. How do you know that? The print's deeper on the right. She's putting more weight there. Sanaya straightened. Something's wrong with the other leg. He looked at her for a long moment, not doubting, recalculating. You track like this back home? My father taught me before he taught my brothers. A flicker of something crossed her face, pride, grief, both tangled together the way they always were now. He said a hunter who can't read ground isn't a hunter. Just a man who got lucky once. Smart man. He was. They found the heifer 20 minutes later, wedged in a gully, with a foreleg caught between two rocks, eyes wild with panic. Caleb worked to free the leg, while Sanaya kept the animal calm, hands steady on its neck, murmuring low words in a language that didn't need translating to do its work. When the leg came free, the heifer scrambled up, shaky but whole, and bolted for open ground. Caleb straightened, brushing dirt from his knees. Would have lost her by morning. You would have found her eventually. Not fast enough. He studied her again, that same recalculating look. You could have kept that to yourself this morning. The tracks. Let me find out the hard way. I could have. She met his eyes. I didn't. Something passed between them then, not quite trust, not yet, but the first plank laid across a gap that had, until that moment, seemed too wide to cross. On the walk back, he showed her, without being asked, where the good grazing land started and stopped, where the water ran even in the driest months, where a man could read the whole shape of a season just by watching which way the grass leaned. She listened, filed it away, because knowledge was the one thing nobody could auction off. The one thing that stayed yours no matter how many hands tried to take everything else. She found the shawl on the 5th day. She hadn't meant to go looking. She'd only been searching the back room for a spare blanket, cold nights coming on faster than the calendar promised, and her hand had closed on something soft, folded, tucked into the bottom of an old trunk she hadn't known was there. Blue wool, hand-stitched hem, a small embroidered flower in one corner, faded but still visible, the kind of careful, patient work that only came from someone who loved the person she was making it for. She was still holding it when Caleb came in. He stopped in the doorway, went very still. That was Rachel's, he said, flat, careful, the way a man talks about a wound he's checking to see if it still bleeds. Sanaya set it down immediately, like it had turned hot in her hands. I didn't mean to. It's fine. He crossed the room, picked it up himself, held it a moment, thumb moving once, over the embroidered flower, and then folded it, slow, deliberate, and set it back in the trunk. Closed the lid. I should have asked, Sanaya said. You didn't do anything wrong. He sat on the edge of the bed frame, hands hanging between his knees, looking older than he had an hour ago. I just haven't opened that trunk in a long time. How long? 5 years. A pause. I keep meaning to give the wool to someone who'd use it. Seems foolish, letting good cloth rot in a box. His jaw tightened. Never manage it, though. Sanaya sat carefully in the chair across from him. Not too close. Close enough. You don't have to explain. I know. He looked at his hands. I want to, though. Strange thing. Haven't wanted to talk about her in years. And now, he stopped himself. Now what? Now there's someone in the house who might understand what it is to carry people who aren't here anymore. The words landed soft, but they landed heavy. Sanaya's throat tightened before she'd even decided what to say back. My mother made a shawl like that, she said. Not that color. Red mostly. She wore it every winter until the year she stopped too. Found she couldn't finish the sentence any easier than he could finish his. They sat there, the two of them, in a room that held one dead wife's shawl and one dead mother's memory, and neither of them tried to fill the silence with comfort that wouldn't have been true. I don't know how you keep going, Sanaya said finally. 5 years alone in this house. Some days I didn't. He said it simply, without drama, the way you'd state a fact about the weather. Some days I just did the chores because the animals didn't care whether I wanted to be alive or not. They just needed feeding. And now, he looked up at her. Gray eyes steady, the way they'd been steady on the platform, the way they'd been steady every moment since. Now I don't know yet, he said. Ask me again in a month. It wasn't much of an answer. She was beginning to understand. The only kind of answer this man ever gave, honest, unfinished, and better than a lie dressed up pretty. The next evening, without explaining why, Caleb walked out past the barn, as the light was fading, and didn't come back for a long while. Sanaya watched from the porch, some old instinct telling her to leave him be, some newer instinct telling her that leaving people be, when they were hurting, wasn't always the kindness it pretended to be. She found him standing at the edge of a small clearing behind a stand of cottonwoods. 2 markers, rough wooden crosses, weathered gray by 5 winters of wind. No names carved into them, just 2 crosses, side by side, small enough that one of them made her chest ache. Before she'd even worked out why, she stopped a respectful distance back. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "I know." He didn't turn. "Been a while since I came out here." "How long?" "Longer than I'd like to admit." His voice had gone rough at the edges. "Some weeks I tell myself I'll come, then I don't. Feels easier some days to just keep moving. Chores don't stop for grief. Cattle don't care." Sanaya came to stand beside him, not too close, the way he'd given her space on the porch. That first night she cried without meaning to. "Rachel," he said, nodding to the taller cross. Then, after a silence that cost him something to cross, nodding to the smaller one. "And Mary." He didn't say more. Didn't need to. The size of the second cross said everything the words didn't have to. Sanaya felt something crack quietly in her chest. Not for herself this time. For him. "I didn't bury them alone," he said. "Neighbors helped dig. Nobody stayed for a service, though. Preacher was 3 days' ride, and half the town was sick besides. Just me and a shovel and the ground too hard, from frost to make it easy. That's a hard thing to carry by yourself. Wasn't much choice in it." He crouched, brushed a stray branch off the base of the taller cross, straightened it where the wind had knocked it crooked. "I used to talk to them out here, tell them about the herd, about the weather. Felt foolish most days. Did it anyway." "It's not foolish." He looked at her then, gray eyes catching the last of the light. "You talk to your dead?" "Every day." The words came out steadier than she expected. "My mother taught me that the dead don't leave. They just change how they travel with you. You carry them instead of walking beside them." His jaw eased, just slightly, not quite comfort, but a man reaching for it, hand not yet closing around the shape of it. "I like that," he said. "Better than what I've been doing, anyway, which is mostly just avoiding this clearing, and hoping the guilt gets tired of following me." "Guilt doesn't get tired." "No." A ghost of something. That wasn't quite a smile. "Guess it doesn't." They stood there together as the light went, from gold to gray to something closer to blue, neither of them in any hurry to be the first to walk away. "Thank you," he said finally, "for coming out here. You didn't ask me to." "I know. Came anyway." He looked at her, and there was something almost like wonder in it, quiet and unpracticed. "Seems to be a habit of yours." She didn't have an answer for that, so she let the silence hold it instead, the way silence, she was learning, could hold more than words sometimes managed to. Life at the ranch found its rhythm. After that, the way water finds the low places in the land, without ever being told to. Mornings began the same. Coffee, bitter and strong. Bread, day-old, softened with a little butter, when they had it. Chores divided without either of them announcing a division. She took the chickens and the garden, he took the horses and the herd, and somewhere in the middle they crossed paths often enough that the day never felt lonely, not the way it must have felt for him alone for 5 years running. He asked her one evening how to say thank you properly in her language. Not the fort version, not the flattened, clumsy approximation soldiers had used. The real word said the real way. She taught him. He mangled it twice. Got it right on the 3rd try, and something in his face, when he finally landed it, a small, surprised satisfaction, like a man who'd cleared a fence he wasn't sure his horse could take, made her laugh before she could stop herself. The sound startled them both. She hadn't laughed since before the soldiers came. "That's a good sound," he said, quiet, like he didn't want to spook it away. "Don't get used to it. Wouldn't dream of it." A pause. "Might try for it again, though." You'll have to earn it. Story of my life, he said. And this time it was her turn to almost smile. Small things, none of them large enough to call anything by name yet. But they stacked, day on day, the way stones stack into a wall, slow, deliberate, until one morning you looked up and realized something had been built that hadn't been there before. The storm came without much warning, the way storms in that country like to. 1 hour the sky was a hard, flat blue. The next, a wall of black had climbed up over the western ridge, moving fast, dragging thunder behind it like something chained. Horses, Caleb said, already moving. Barn now. They ran. Wind hit first, hard enough to stagger, throwing dust and dead brush sideways across the yard. Then the rain, cold and sudden, needling against exposed skin. The mare was already spooked by the time Sanaya reached her stall, eyes rolled white, hooves striking sparks off the packed earth floor. Sanaya didn't hesitate, didn't reach for the halter the way a nervous hand would have, fast and grabbing. She slowed down instead, let her voice drop low, steady, the same tone she'd used to calm the injured heifer days before. Easy, she murmured, in her own language now, words that didn't need translating for an animal, that only cared about the sound underneath them. Easy, easy. The mare's ears flicked toward her, found something in the voice to trust, settled just enough. Across the barn, Caleb wrestled the barn doors closed against wind that fought him for every inch, thunder cracking close enough now to rattle the boards over their heads. Lightning turned the whole barn white for one blinding second, and in that second Sanaya saw him, braced against the door, jaw set, rain plastering his shirt to his shoulders, and her breath caught in a way that had nothing to do with the storm at all. The door slammed shut. The barn went dark again, lit only by the thin gray light bleeding through the cracks in the boards. You all right? He called over the storm. Fine. Her hand still rested on the mare's neck, feeling the animal's heartbeat slow under her palm. You? Wet. A beat. Otherwise fine. She almost laughed again. Twice in 1 week now. She was losing count of how many times this man had managed that without seeming to try. The storm hammered the roof for the better part of an hour. They sat it out together on overturned crates near the horses, close enough to hear each other, over the rain, without shouting, far enough that neither of them had to think too hard about the distance. You're good with them, Caleb said, nodding at the mare, calm now, dozing on 3 legs the way horses did, when they trusted the ground under them again. The horses. They're not so different from people. Sanaya watched the rain find new paths, through gaps in the roof, small silver threads catching what light there was. Scared animals need someone who isn't scared back at them, even if the someone's just pretending. You pretending? Sometimes. She looked at him sideways. You? More than I'd like to admit. He turned his hat over in his hands, working at a loose seam that didn't need working. Been pretending for 5 years, if I'm honest. Pretending the work was enough. Pretending I didn't need anything else. Was it enough? He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. No, he said finally. Simple. Unadorned. The way he said everything that mattered. Wasn't enough. Just didn't have anything better to do with the days. And now, he looked at her, and for the first time since the platform, since the ropes, since the whole terrible unraveling of the life she used to have, Sanaya saw something in a man's eyes that wasn't hunger and wasn't pity and wasn't calculation. It looked, unmistakably, like a question he wasn't sure he had the right to ask yet. Now, he said, the days don't feel quite so long. Neither of them said anything else. The rain kept falling. The horses kept dozing. And something unspoken settled into the space between them, quiet and patient, willing to wait, until one of them was brave enough to give it a name. The storm broke an hour before dusk, moving on to trouble some other stretch of country, leaving the yard washed clean and steaming faintly in the cooling air. They walked back to the house together, not touching, not needing to. Some things didn't need touching to be understood. She started weaving again on a quiet afternoon, almost without deciding to. It began with reeds pulled from along the creek bank, gathered while she filled the water buckets, more habit than plan. Her fingers remembered the motion, before her mind caught up to what they were doing: soak, split, bend. The same rhythm her mother's hands had moved in 1,000 evenings around the fire, teaching her without ever once calling it a lesson. By the time Caleb came in from the fields, she had the beginnings of a small basket taking shape in her lap, tight coils building up. From a center she'd started, without thinking, the pattern rising the way it always used to, like the reeds already knew the shape they were meant to become. He stopped in the doorway, watched a moment before she noticed him. "That's fine work," he said. She looked up, startled out of the rhythm. "It's nothing, just something to do with my hands." Didn't look like nothing. He crossed to the table, careful not to crowd her, and studied the half-finished basket with an attention that surprised her. "My grandmother used to weave, different pattern, different reeds, but the same look on her face while she did it, like she'd gone somewhere else for a while." "Where did she go?" "Never asked her." He almost smiled. Didn't seem like the kind of question you interrupt someone to answer. Sanaya's hands kept moving, coil after coil, while she considered that. "My mother used to say weaving was how you talk to people who weren't in the room anymore," she said. "You think about them while your hands work. Somehow that makes it feel like they're helping you finish it." "Who are you talking to?" She didn't answer right away. Her fingers found the next coil, tightened it, moved on. "All of them," she said finally. "My mother, my father, my brothers, even the ones I don't have names to put to anymore, the aunts and the cousins, the whole shape of a family I used to have, and don't know how to count anymore." Her throat tightened, but her hands didn't stop. "This is the first thing I've made since it happened. Didn't realize how much I missed it until my hands started doing it without asking me." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "Keep it up," he said finally. "Whatever you need to talk to them. This house has room for it." "You don't think it's strange? Talking to the dead through a basket?" "I talk to 2 crosses behind the cottonwoods most weeks." He shrugged, though something in the gesture didn't come easy. "Don't think I've got much room to call anybody's grief strange." She looked at him for a long moment, weighing something, and then went back to her weaving, coil after coil, the shape of the basket rising steady in her lap, while the last of the daylight came slanting gold through the window. Neither of them spoke again for a while. They didn't need to. The basket sat finished on the windowsill by the following evening, small, tightly woven, imperfect in the way first attempts, after a long absence always were, but whole, and hers. She kept it there after that. A small, stubborn piece of everything she'd lost, remade with her own 2 hands in a house that had, without either of them quite noticing when, started to feel less like a stranger's, and more like somewhere she might, one day, be allowed to call something like home. The rider came a few afternoons later. That morning had started ordinary enough. Coffee, chores, Caleb out checking the fence line north of the property. The same fence line he'd checked every few days, since she'd arrived, though she hadn't thought to ask why so often. "You keep going up that way," she said over breakfast. "More than the rest of the fence." He didn't look up from his cup right away. "Boundaries disputed. Has been for years." Disputed by who? Neighbor. A pause, the kind of pause that told her there was more behind the word than he wanted to hand over yet. "We don't talk much." "Why not?" Caleb set his cup down. "Some men you don't need a reason to avoid. You just learn it in your bones the first time you shake their hand." She filed that away too, because a man like Caleb, who chose his words the way other men chose their bullets, careful, sparing, never wasted, didn't say something like that without meaning every syllable of it. By afternoon, she was out near the barn, mending a torn strap on the mare's bridle, when the air changed. She felt it before she heard anything, a stillness that wasn't natural. Even the chickens had gone quiet, clustering low against the coop wall the way animals do, when something is coming that they can smell before people can see it. Sanaya saw him first, a shape on the horizon, moving fast, kicking up a low trail of dust that hung in the still air longer than it should have. She called out. Caleb was at the barn in 3 strides, rifle in hand, before the rider had cleared the last rise. The horse was black, lathered with sweat, ridden hard and ridden mean. The man on it was broad, through the shoulders, red-faced, the kind of red that came from more than sun. Thus, he pulled up short in front of the house. Didn't dismount. Hollis. Voss. Caleb's voice had gone flat. Careful. You're a long way from your own land. Your land backs onto mine. Voss's eyes flicked past Caleb, found Sanaya standing near the porch, and something in his expression curdled. Didn't figure you for a man who'd bring that back to a working ranch. Her name, Caleb said, is Sanaya. I don't care what it is. Voss's hand rested on his saddle horn, close enough to his belt, that Sanaya's pulse ticked up a notch. I care that you drag trouble home with you, and trouble has a way of spreading past fence lines. What do you want, Voss? I want you to think real hard about what you're doing. Voss's horse shifted under him, restless. This land's dry 6 months out of 12. You know that better than anybody. Man needs every advantage he can get, and a man who goes stirring up the town over some Apache woman. I didn't stir up anything. You bid $200 in front of half the county. Voss's jaw worked. That's stirring, whether you meant it or not. Man can spend his own money how he likes, not when it makes trouble for his neighbors. Voss's eyes cut sideways, found Sanaya, held there a beat too long. This is a decent town, Hollis. Folks here don't want to see what you're carrying on with paraded up and down Main Street. Nobody's carrying on with anything. That's not how it'll look come Sunday, when the whole congregation's asking why Caleb Hollis rode into town with an Apache woman sitting behind his saddle like she belonged there. Sanaya stood very still, because she'd heard this tone before. It wasn't about her, not really. Men like Voss didn't ride 5 miles in the heat over principle. They rode 5 miles when something of theirs was at risk. Watch his hands, her father used to say about men who talk too much and too loud. A man who's certain doesn't need to convince you twice. Voss had said the same thing 3 different ways now. Stirring trouble. Decent town. What it'll look like. 3 ways of saying the same lie. Which meant it wasn't the truth he was protecting. It was something else. This isn't about her, she said. Quiet. Both men turned. Voss's eyes narrowed. Excuse me? You didn't ride out here for me. Her voice stayed level even though her heart wasn't. You rode out here for something else, and you're using me to get to it. For a moment, something flickered across Voss's face. Surprise, maybe, that she'd spoken at all or that she'd spoken right. Careful, he said low. Or what? Caleb's hand tightened on the rifle. Not raising it, just reminding the air it was there. Voss's gaze shifted back to Caleb, and something in his posture changed, the anger banking down into something colder, more calculating. There's a spring, Voss said, up past your north fence, feeds into the water table that keeps my herd alive come August, when every other well in this county runs to mud. He let that sit. Your father-in-law's people surveyed that boundary wrong 30 years back, and everybody's been too polite or too lazy to fix it. I mean to fix it. Caleb's face didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. So this was never about her. It was never about her. Voss's mouth curved, without warmth. It's about 100 acres you don't use and I need. I figured a friendly conversation might settle it, before it needed to be anything else. His eyes cut to Sanaya again, flat and assessing. But if you're going to make yourself a problem in town, over some woman nobody in this county wants around, that friendly conversation gets harder to have. The land's not for sale, Caleb said. Everything's for sale, Hollis. You proved that yourself yesterday. $200. Voss's smile thinned into something uglier. Questions just what the price turns out to be. He wheeled his horse without waiting for an answer, kicked it into a trot, then a canter, dust rising behind him like a signal fire. Neither of them moved until the sound of hooves had faded into the general hush of the afternoon. "He'll come back," Sanaya said. "I know." With more than words next time. Caleb lowered the rifle, but he didn't relax. Not really. Just shifted the weight of the fear into somewhere less visible. Probably. He looked at her, something unreadable working behind the gray of his eyes. "You didn't have to say anything back there. You were about to let him think this was about your fence line." She crossed her arms, feeling the old rope burn ache in her wrists, as she did. "It's not entirely." "What do you mean?" She hesitated, because the thought forming in her chest was still half-shaped. A shadow more than a shape, something she'd caught the edge of in Voss's voice, and wasn't ready to say plainly yet. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But a man like that doesn't ride out over a fence line. He rides out because he's scared of losing something bigger than water." Caleb studied her for a long moment. The wind picked up, carrying dust across the yard, catching in the folds of her borrowed coat. "You think there's more to it?" "I think," she said slowly, "that men like him always have more to hide than they let show. And I think you should ask yourself why a man who's never once spoken a kind word to you in 5 years suddenly cared enough to ride out here himself, instead of sending one of his hands." Something crossed Caleb's face then, not quite recognition, not yet, but the first cold edge of a question he hadn't let himself ask in a long time. He didn't answer her. He just looked north toward the fence line, toward the spring that fed water into ground that had swallowed more than crops over the years. Caleb stood a moment longer after she'd said it, turning the thought over the way he turned over a fence post before deciding whether it would hold weight. Because she wasn't wrong. He knew that much even before he could say why. Voss had never ridden out to his land before. Not once in 5 years, not even when their fence lines had needed mending, after a bad winter, not even when a stray bull had wandered onto Voss land, and Caleb had sent word offering to pay for any damage. Voss had ignored the offer. Ignored him entirely, the way a man ignores something he's decided isn't worth the trouble of hating properly. Until yesterday. Until a woman stood on an auction platform, and Caleb Hollis, of all people, raised his hand. That wasn't a coincidence. Caleb didn't believe much in coincidence anymore. Not after Rachel. Not after Mary. The world, he'd learned the hard way, didn't often bother with anything so gentle as coincidence. It preferred consequence. It preferred debts coming due at the worst possible hour. He thought about the spring Voss had mentioned, the boundary dispute that had sat quiet for 30 years, untouched, unmentioned, right up until the moment it became useful leverage against a man who'd embarrassed Voss in front of half the county. Your father-in-law's people surveyed that boundary wrong. Rachel's father had died before Caleb ever met her. He'd never once, in 5 years of marriage, and 5 more of widowhood, heard anyone mention a survey error. Not a neighbor, not a lawyer, not so much as a rumor over cards at the saloon, which meant either Voss was lying about the survey, or Voss had known about it for years and simply never needed it before now. Neither answer sat easy in Caleb's stomach. He thought about Rachel's laugh, the way it used to fill this yard on evenings not so different from this one, before the fever came and took the sound of it away for good. He thought about the 5 years since, the long gray stretch of them, chores and silence, and a grief he'd gotten, so used to carrying, that some mornings he forgot it was there, until it caught him sideways, unannounced, over something as small as the smell of bread baking. And he thought about the woman standing beside him now, chin still raised the way it had been on that platform, refusing, even now, even here, even after everything, to let this land or this life or this trouble bow her head. He didn't know yet what Voss was hiding, but he knew, standing there as the light failed around them, that he wasn't going to let Sanaya pay the price for finding out. Whatever it cost him. And in the silence that followed, Sanaya understood, without being able to say exactly how, that whatever Silas Voss was hiding behind his talk of boundaries and springs, it went back further than a survey drawn wrong 30 years ago. It went back, she suspected, to the same 5 years that had left Caleb Hollis alone in this house, with nothing but a dead wife's memory, and a bracelet he didn't know the full weight of. The sun was sinking now, the sky bruising toward evening, and somewhere out past the fence line a hawk called once, sharp and clear, and fell silent. Neither of them moved to go inside. Because some silences, Sanaya was beginning to understand, weren't peace at all. They were just the quiet before something broke. That night, after Caleb had banked the fire and gone quiet in his chair by the hearth, Sanaya lay awake again. Not from nightmares this time, from something more like arithmetic, the kind that wouldn't leave her alone. Voss's face when he'd said your father-in-law's people surveyed, that boundary wrong. The way his eyes had flicked to the trunk room door, just once, just for a heartbeat, like he knew exactly what was folded inside that trunk and exactly how long it had been sitting there. She thought of the shawl. Blue wool, small embroidered flower, 5 years untouched. She thought of Caleb saying fever swept, through the way a man says a word he said. So many times it's worn smooth, sanded down until it barely means anything at all anymore. 5 years. The same 5 years Voss had apparently spent circling this land like a man waiting for something to come loose. She didn't know yet what the two things had to do with each other. But she'd learned, the hard way, that when a wound and a lie showed up in the same story, they were rarely strangers to each other. She closed her eyes, didn't sleep for a long time. Somewhere past the wall, she could hear Caleb's breathing settle into the slow rhythm of a man who'd finally let himself rest. She hoped, for his sake, that whatever she was starting to suspect wasn't true. She was already fairly sure it was, because that was the trouble with grief and lies. They wore the same clothes sometimes, sat in the same rooms, took years to tell apart unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. And Sanaya, lying awake in a stranger's house, that no longer felt entirely strange, had just started looking. She thought about her father's bracelet, worn smooth by 15 years on a stranger's wrist. She thought about a blue shawl folded away in a trunk nobody could bring themselves to open. She thought about 2 small crosses behind a stand of cottonwoods. One of them, so much smaller than the other, small enough that she still had to look away every time she let herself remember it. Fever, Caleb had said, swept through town one winter. 5 years ago. The same 5 years, near enough since the soldiers had come for her own people, since the treaties had stopped meaning anything, since men like Voss had started circling land that wasn't theirs with the patience of something that knew it only had to wait. She didn't have the whole shape of it yet. Just pieces, a boundary dispute that had sat quiet for 30 years and surfaced, conveniently, the moment it became useful. A rancher who rode 5 miles in the heat, over water he claimed to need, when water hadn't stopped him from ignoring Caleb for 5 years running. A dead wife and a dead daughter, buried without a service, the ground too hard, from frost to make the digging easy. None of it proved anything. All of it pointed somewhere. She turned onto her side, facing the wall, listening to the house settle around her the way it settled every night now, familiar in a way that still surprised her, comfortable in a way she hadn't let herself trust yet and wasn't sure she ever fully would. Tomorrow she decided she would ask him more about the fever. Not to reopen a wound, just to understand its shape. Because a wound you understood was a wound you could eventually help someone carry, and she was beginning to suspect that carrying things was going to be a large part of whatever came next for both of them. Outside, the wind moved, through the cottonwoods behind the house, past 2 small crosses standing quiet in the dark, past a fence line disputed for 30 years, and suddenly, urgently, contested again. Somewhere beyond that fence line, in a house far grander than this one, Silas Voss was awake too. She didn't know that for certain, but she felt it the way she used to feel weather coming, before the sky gave any sign of it. A pressure building somewhere just past the edge of what she could see. Whatever he was protecting, he'd protected it for 5 years without anyone asking questions. She was about to become someone who asked. Sleep found her eventually, thin and uneasy, but sleep all the same. And in the last waking moment, before it took her, one thought surfaced clear above all the others, simple and unshakable as stone. Whatever happened next, She would not be standing on a platform for it. Not again. This time, she intended to be the one asking the questions. And she intended to get answers. Morning came gray, and lo, clouds sitting on the ridge like something that hadn't decided whether to break yet. Sanaya woke to the sound of Caleb already moving in the other room. Boots, the scrape of a saddlebag being filled. Not urgent, just deliberate. The sound of a man doing something he'd rather not do, but had already decided he was going to. She lay still a moment longer, listening, because sleep had come thin and uneasy after the night before, threaded through with half-formed worry she hadn't managed to name before it woke her. Voss's face in the torchlight. That was the thing that kept surfacing. Not the anger in it, the certainty. Men who threatened out of anger burned themselves out eventually. Men who threatened out of certainty didn't stop until something stopped them. She found Caleb at the table, a short list scratched onto a scrap of paper. Flour, salt, ammunition, coffee, underlined twice. "You're going to town," she said. "We're low." He didn't look up. "Can't hold out here on pride alone. After yesterday. Especially after yesterday." He folded the list, tucked it into his coat. A man who hides after a threat just teaches the man making it that threats work. Sanaya crossed her arms. "And if Voss has men waiting, then we'll know that too." She studied him a long moment, because there was a stubbornness in him that ran quiet underneath the calm, the same stubbornness she'd started to recognize in herself, the kind that didn't announce itself with shouting, just refused, flatly, to bend. "I'm coming," she said. "No. You can't stop me. I can try." "Why?" "Because showing up together looks like defiance." His jaw tightened. "And defiance is exactly what Voss wants an excuse to answer. And showing up alone looks like fear." She held his gaze unflinching. "Which do you think he respects less?" Caleb didn't answer right away, which was its own kind of answer. "Fine," he said finally. "But you stay close. And if I tell you to run, I don't run. Then you'll learn to, or you'll get us both killed." His voice had gone rough at the edges, not with anger. With fear he wasn't saying out loud. "Please." The word landed strange between them. He didn't use it often. "All right," she said. "I'll run. If you tell me to." It wasn't quite a promise. They both knew it. But it was close enough to satisfy the morning, and they saddled the horses, without another word. Except her mind wouldn't stay quiet the whole ride in. Because something about yesterday's threat had felt different from the ones before it. Rehearsed, almost, like a man reading lines he'd already decided on, before he ever climbed into the saddle. And a man who planned his threats that carefully didn't stop at threats. She kept that thought to herself. No sense handing Caleb one more weight to carry into town on top of everything else already sitting on his shoulders. They paused on the ridge above Ironwood Flats, before descending, both of them scanning the streets below out of habit more than expectation. Two riders moved along the far edge of town, unhurried, the kind of patrol a man posted when he wanted eyes on the road, without making it look like he was watching for anyone in particular. "Voss's men," Caleb said, jaw tight. "You think they know we're coming? Word travels fast in a town this small. Wouldn't take much for someone to send word ahead the moment we left the ranch." He studied the distant riders a moment longer. "Doesn't mean we turn back. Just means we go in with our eyes open. We always go in with our eyes open. This time more than most." He nudged his horse forward, down the slope toward the waiting town. "Stay close." She didn't need telling twice. Ironwood Flats looked the same as it had 5 days ago. Dusty, tired, suspicious of anything that moved through it without permission. But the air had changed. Sanaya felt it the moment they crossed the town line. A tightness in the street that hadn't been there before, the way animals go still before weather they can't yet see. A woman pulled her wash line in early. A man loading a wagon turned his back deliberately, the way you turn your back on something you don't want to be caught looking at. Near the church steps, the older woman in the faded gray dress stood again, the same one who'd given Sanaya that small, hidden nod on the day of the auction. Their eyes met for a heartbeat across the width of the street. This time there was no nod, just a small, urgent shake of the head, barely a movement at all, but unmistakable in its meaning. Don't. Not today. Turn around. Sanaya's stomach tightened. She glanced at Caleb, but he hadn't seen it, already dismounting outside the store, already committed to the errand he'd decided on. She wanted to tell him, wanted to say something's different today, worse than yesterday, we should leave. But what proof did she have? A shake of a stranger's head, a feeling in her chest she couldn't put words to yet, which wasn't nothing. Her father had taught her that feelings like this one were rarely nothing. Except she'd also learned, the hard way, that you couldn't run from every shadow, or you'd spend your whole life running, and never once standing still long enough to build something worth defending. So she said nothing, tied her horse, followed him toward the store. They tied the horses outside the general store. Pruitt stood in the doorway, before they'd even dismounted, arms crossed, blocking the frame like a man guarding something more valuable than flour and salt. Hollis! Pruitt's eyes flicked past him. Found Sanaya. Hardened. Told you last time. Don't bring her in here. I told you I'm buying for both of us. Caleb's voice stayed level. That hasn't changed. It has now. Pruitt didn't move from the doorway. You're refusing my business. I'm refusing hers. Same thing. Pruitt's face reddened, the color climbing fast, the way it climbs on a man who knows he's on the wrong side of something and has decided to be loud about it instead of right. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Hollis. No. Caleb's eyes didn't waver. You are. For a long moment, neither man moved. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and went quiet, like even it had decided to stay out of this one. Then Pruitt stepped aside, muttering something under his breath that neither of them asked him to repeat. Inside, the air was thick with a hostility that didn't need words to make itself known. Pruitt slammed items onto the counter as Caleb read off the list: flour, salt, coffee, dried beans, a box of shells, each one landing, with a crack sharp enough to make Sanaya's shoulders tighten. That'll be $12, Pruitt said when he finished, not looking at either of them. Caleb counted it out, set it on the counter. Pruitt swept the coins up without checking them. His eyes flicked to Sanaya, quick and mean. You're making enemies, Hollis. He shook his head. And for what? A woman who'll slit your throat first chance she gets. If that's what you believe, Caleb said, you don't know her. And you do. Better than you ever will. Pruitt's jaw worked. He shoved the supplies across the counter, without another word. Get out. They gathered the goods and walked, the weight of the town's stairs pressing down on them the whole length of the street. A physical thing, heavy as the sacks of flour on Caleb's shoulder. Outside, a small crowd had already gathered. Word traveled fast in a town this size, faster than a man could load a wagon. Sanaya saw the shapes before she saw the faces. 3 of them standing loose and easy near the hitching post, the kind of easy that was really just tension wearing a relaxed face. One of them, lean, a scar cutting pale, through one eyebrow, stepped forward, blocking the path to the horses. Well, look at this, he said, grinning at nothing funny. Hollis brought his pet. Sanaya's jaw tightened. She said nothing, because words, she'd learned, were wasted on men who'd already decided what they wanted to see. Caleb set the supplies down slow, deliberate, the way a man sets something down, when he wants both hands free without announcing it. Move, he said. Or what? Or I move you. The scarred man laughed, short and ugly. I'd like to see you try. Caleb didn't wait for a second invitation. His fist connected with the man's jaw before the laugh had fully finished leaving his mouth. Hard, fast, no wasted motion, the same efficiency he brought to everything else. The man staggered back, blood spraying. The crowd erupted, a wave of noise breaking over the street. A second man lunged. They went down together in a tangle of fists and dust, boots scrabbling for purchase in the dry street. Sanaya's heart slammed against her ribs. Because this was exactly what Voss wanted, wasn't it? Public brawl. Witnesses. A story he could shape however suited him best by evening. Except there was no time to think that all the way through. Because the third man was already moving toward her, and thinking clearly was a luxury that belonged to people who weren't currently being circled by someone twice their weight. She moved without deciding to move. Stepped between the third man and Caleb, a knife already in her hand. The one Caleb had given her without comment. The one she'd started wearing at her hip like it had always belonged there. "Stay back," she said. The third man looked at her, at the knife, laughed, though it came out thinner than he probably meant it to. "You think that scares me? I think you don't want to find out." Her pulse hammered. Her hand stayed steady, which struck her, even in the middle of everything, as its own small victory. A body that had learned, finally, how to be afraid and capable at the very same moment. For one long second, he seemed to actually weigh it. Then he stepped back, shaking his head, muttering something about it not being worth it. The fight ended as fast as it had started. Caleb shoved the second man off him, and rose, blood running from a cut above his eye, breathing hard. The scarred man knelt in the dirt, spitting red into the dust. "We're leaving," Caleb said. They backed toward the horses, Sanaya's knife still in her hand, the crowd's noise following them like something with teeth. Caleb swung up first, reached down. She took his hand, let him pull her up behind him, and they rode out of town at a hard trot, the shouting fading slowly behind them, into the general hush of the afternoon. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was sinking, and Caleb's face had gone pale under the blood, though he wouldn't admit how much the ride had cost him. Sanaya cleaned the cut above his eye at the table, water heated, cloth pressed careful against the wound. "You shouldn't have hit him," she said. "He was asking for it. You made things worse. They were already worse." She dabbed at the cut, feeling him flinch, her own jaw tightening in sympathy every time he did. "Why do you keep doing this?" she asked. "Fighting for me. Putting yourself in the middle of it." He was quiet a long moment. "Because no one else will," he said finally. Her hand stilled against his jaw. She looked at him, this man who'd bought her freedom, and then handed it back, who'd stood between her and a town full of hate, without once asking whether it was worth the cost to himself. She didn't have an answer that felt big enough. So she finished cleaning the wound instead, and let the silence say what her words couldn't quite manage. When the bandage was tied off, Caleb stood, testing the arm, wincing but functional. "We need to prepare," he said. "Voss won't wait long after today. Not after what happened in town." "Prepare how?" "Board the windows. Move the ammunition where we can reach it fast. Fill every bucket we have in case they try fire again." His jaw was set, already working through the list. "Anything we can't afford to lose, we bring inside tonight." They worked through the afternoon, with a grim, wordless efficiency. The same rhythm they'd built mending fences now turned toward something far more urgent. Senia nailed boards across the windows, from the inside, leaving narrow gaps to shoot through, the way her father had once shown her, when raiders threatened the winter camp. Caleb checked every rifle twice, laid out shells in neat rows along the table, counted and recounted supplies like the numbers might change, if he willed them to. "How many can we hold off?" Sanaya asked, watching him work. "Depends how many he brings." Caleb didn't look up. "Depends how much he wants this to be over quick or how much he wants it to send a message." "Which do you think? After today, in front of half the town?" His jaw tightened. "He'll want it to send a message." Sanaya set down the hammer, moved to stand beside him at the table, close enough to see the tension in his shoulders, that his voice didn't let show. "We could still run," she said, testing the idea more than proposing it. "Leave tonight. Let him have the land." He wouldn't stop there. Caleb met her eyes. Man like Voss doesn't take a retreat as an ending. He'd take it as proof it worked. He'd come looking for the next thing to take and the next until somebody finally stops him. "So we stop him here." We stop him here. She nodded slowly, and something passed between them. Not quite courage, not quite fear, but some steadier thing built, from both, the particular resolve of two people who'd already decided, without needing to say it aloud, that they'd rather stand together than run alone. That night, they ate in near silence, the fire cracking low in the stove, both of them listening, though neither said so out loud, for the sound of hooves that hadn't come yet. They'll come back, Sanaya said when the meal was done. I know. Tonight. Maybe. He stood, moved to the window, looked out at the darkening yard. Get some rest if you can. I'll keep watch. I'll take a turn. Later. A pause. Rest first. She didn't argue. Exhaustion pulled her under, before she'd finished deciding whether to. She woke twice before midnight, each time to the same silence, the same dark, the same sense of Caleb sitting motionless by the window, rifle across his knees, watching a yard that offered nothing but shadow and wind-bent grass. The second time, she didn't go back to sleep, just lay there, listening to her own heartbeat, counting it the way her mother taught her, waiting for the sound that would tell her whether tonight was the night, or whether they'd earned one more quiet stretch of darkness before it came. Because that was the cruelest part of waiting for violence. Not the violence itself, the waiting, the way it stretched every ordinary sound. A settling board, a shifting horse, the wind finding a gap in the wall, into something that might be the first note of the thing you were dreading. She got up eventually, sat across from Caleb without a word. He didn't send her back to bed, just handed her the second rifle, already loaded, and went back to watching the dark. You think he'll wait for the moon to go down? She asked, quiet. Man like Voss doesn't wait for anything he doesn't have to. Caleb's eyes stayed on the yard. He'll come when he's ready. Moon won't factor into it. How do you know? Because a man who's certain he'll win doesn't worry about being seen doing it. The gunfire started an hour past midnight. Except it wasn't gunfire that came first. It was Caleb's hand closing sudden around her arm, urgent but silent, his other hand pointing toward the window, toward a shape moving low along the fence line, scouting ahead of whatever came behind it. Sanaya didn't reach for the rifle. She reached instead for the bow she'd strung 2 nights before, the one she'd built from ash wood and sinew during the quiet hours of watch, fingers remembering a craft she hadn't practiced since before the soldiers came. Caleb had watched her make it without asking why, had seemed to understand without being told that some tools mattered beyond their usefulness, that rebuilding a thing her father once taught her to build was its own kind of survival, separate from anything to do with defense. Tonight, it proved useful in exactly the way that mattered most. She nocked an arrow, drew, released, all of it silent, all of it fast muscle memory older than her fear guiding the motion. The scout dropped without a sound, and for one crucial stretch of time, Voss's men lost their eyes on the house, before they even knew they'd lost them. How many can you get, before they know we're awake? Caleb whispered. As many as get close enough. She took a second, before the first alarm finally rose. From the dark, someone shouting, torches suddenly flaring to life all along the tree line, the element of surprise burning away, as fast as it had arrived. But 2 men down before the fight had even properly begun, that bought them something. A little room, a little time, then the real gunfire started, and there was no more room left for anything but survival. The sound hit like thunder already struck close, body moving faster than the mind could fully catch up, adrenaline arriving ahead of understanding. Down. Caleb's voice, sharp, from the other room. Stay down. She was at the window in the same breath, rifle in her hands now, bow set aside for whatever came next. Torches. She counted them without meaning to, the old habit rising fast, 6, 8, more scattered in the dark beyond the reach of the flame light, moving in a loose, deliberate line toward the house. Her heart hammered. Her hands did not shake. That surprised her distantly in the part of her mind that still had room to be surprised by anything. Because fear and steadiness could live in the same body. Her father had taught her that too once long ago in a life that felt like it belonged to someone else now. How many? Caleb called from the other window. 8, maybe more in the dark. Was? She scanned the shapes, found the one riding slightly ahead of the others, broad through the shoulders, unmistakable even in torchlight. He's here himself. Something in Caleb's silence told her that meant something. That a man like Voss, who sent others to do his dirty work, riding out to do it personally now, that was its own kind of confession. A voice carried across the yard, amplified by night air and open ground. Hollis. Voss's voice. Flat. Final. Last chance. Send her out and we forget this ever happened. Not going to happen, Voss. You'd die for her. Man like you. 5 years of nothing. And you'll die for a woman you've known 2 weeks. Wouldn't call it nothing. Caleb's voice carried steady across the dark yard. Might be the first thing in 5 years that's actually meant something. Sentiment. Voss's laugh carried no warmth in it at all. Won't stop a bullet. Neither will your money, once this is done. A pause. Long enough that Sanaya could feel Voss's certainty flicker. Just slightly, somewhere out there in the dark. Then we do this the hard way. Caleb didn't wait for the next line. He fired first, the crack of it splitting the night wide open, and one of the riders jerked backward, torch spinning into the dirt. The line surged forward. Sanaya fired, missed, steadied, fired again, and a horse screamed, going down hard, throwing its rider into the dust. Gunfire erupted from both sides now, bullets thudding into the wood siding, punching through glass, filling the small house with a violence that felt too large for its walls to hold. Sanaya's ears rang. Her hands moved on their own, fire, reload, while some distant part of her mind kept trying to catch up, kept trying to make sense of a night that had gone in the space of a few heartbeats from silence to chaos. Because this was different from the first attack. Worse, more men, more torches. Voss himself out there in the dark, which meant he'd stopped being careful about what people might later say he'd done. Which meant he intended for there to be no one left alive to say it. She fired again. A man dropped near the corral fence, and she didn't let herself feel anything about it yet. Feeling would come later if there was a later. Right now there was only the next shot and the one after that. Barn, Caleb shouted. They're going for the barn. She turned. Saw 3 shapes breaking off toward the structure, torches raised. If the barn burned, the horses would die. Everything would die with it. She was moving before she'd finished the thought, rifle up, aiming through the shattered window at the nearest torch bearer. She fired. He dropped. The second man kept running. She reloaded with hands that had gone cold and fast, the way her father's hands used to move when a hunt turned into something more urgent than a hunt. Caleb grabbed a second rifle, shoved it toward her. Keep them off the house. I'm going out. You can't. But he was already, through the back door, gone into the dark, and there was nothing left to do but keep firing, keep the front of the house from being overrun, while he did whatever he decided needed doing. Outside, his rifle barked twice, sharp and close together. Then a scream, then a silence that stretched too long, too empty, before it finally broke. The back door slamming open, Caleb stumbling through it, blood running dark down one arm. You're hit, Sanaya said. It's nothing. You're bleeding. I said it's nothing. He grabbed a bucket, threw water on a small fire licking at the doorframe, where a torch had landed too close. They got the barn. Horses are out. Building's gone, but the horses are out. Gunfire concentrated now, focused hard on the front of the house, the door shuddering under the weight of it. Sanaya's heart hammered against her ribs, because the door wouldn't hold much longer, because the boards Caleb had nailed across it that afternoon were already splintering, already giving way one crack at a time. They're coming through, she said. Caleb braced himself against the door, as it split, with splintering under the impact of bodies throwing themselves against it. The door gave. Men poured through the gap, and the fight went, from rifles to something closer, uglier, hand to hand in the cramped dark of the front room. There was no time to think after that. Only react, only move. Caleb swung his rifle like a club, cracking it across someone's jaw. Sanaya slashed with the knife, felt it connect, felt a man's grip release from around her arm as he stumbled back with a cry. A rifle but caught her across the shoulder, hard enough to spin her half around. Pain bloomed white and sharp. She recovered anyway, drove her elbow back into something soft, heard the grunt of pain, spun and brought her blade up in the same motion. Across the room, Caleb was grappling with two men at once, absorbing blows to the ribs and face, giving back harder than he took. He broke one man's nose with his forehead, threw the other against the wall hard enough to crack old wood. A hand closed around Sanaya's ankle. From the floor, a wounded man, still fighting, still dangerous, even bleeding out on old boards. She kicked free, didn't look back to see what became of him, because there wasn't room in a fight like this one for anything but the next second, and the one after that. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the room was empty except for the wounded, and the still. The remaining torches were retreating outside, fewer than before, moving in disarray, through smoke and dust. Voss sat his horse at the edge of the yard, face twisted with a rage that hadn't gotten what it came for. He fired once more into the house, the shot going wide, then wheeled his horse hard and kicked it into a run. The others followed, dragging their wounded, leaving the dead behind. Sanaya watched the torches shrink into distant sparks, swallowed slowly by the dark. Then her legs gave out, and she sat down hard on the ruined floor. Caleb slid down the wall beside her, breathing ragged, blood soaking through his sleeve. "We're alive," she said. Came out more question than statement. Barely enough. He looked at her, something raw moving behind his eyes. "You saved my life tonight. More than once. You saved mine first. Doesn't work that way. Then how does it work? I don't know anymore." He shook his head slowly, exhaustion and something gentler tangled together in the gesture. "I don't know anymore." They buried 5 men behind the burned barn, as the sky went from black to gray to the raw pink of a sunrise that felt obscene after the night it followed. Sanaya didn't recognize all of them. Some wore faces from town. Others were strangers, hired men Voss had brought in from somewhere further out, paid to die for a piece of land they'd never even seen before tonight. They worked in silence, the digging slow in ground still cold from the night before. Caleb's bandaged arm made the shovel work clumsy, and twice Sanaya took it from him without asking, without either of them making it a discussion. Partway through, he stopped, stood there with the shovel loose in his hands, looking down at the half-dug grave like he was seeing something else entirely. "I keep thinking," he said, "about how many of these men had families, wives, children who'll wait tonight for a man who isn't coming home. They came here to kill us." "I know." His jaw worked. "Doesn't make the thinking stop." Sanaya set her own shovel down, came to stand beside him. "You're not the one who sent them," she said. "Voss did. Their blood is his to carry, not yours. Feels like it should be shared out more evenly than that. Maybe it should." She looked at the ground, at the work still left to do. "But carrying guilt that isn't fully yours doesn't honor the dead. It just wastes the strength you'll need to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else." He looked at her a long moment, something loosening slightly in his shoulders. "When did you get so wise?" he said. Not quite teasing, not quite serious either. "Watched my father bury men he'd had to kill in defense of our camp." She picked her shovel back up. "He said the same thing to me once, when I was young enough to ask him why it didn't seem to break him the way I expected it to." "Did it break him?" "Some. Just not where anyone could see it." She resumed digging. "I think that's the only way men like you and my father manage to keep going. You let it break something small and private, and you keep the rest of yourself standing for whatever comes next." Caleb picked his own shovel back up, and they finished the grave together, side by side, the sun climbing slow and merciless over a night that neither of them would ever fully set down. When it was done, Caleb drove a plain wooden stake into the freshest mound, marking it without ceremony, and turned away. They didn't speak until they were back inside. The house wrecked around them, door hanging broken, windows shattered, bullet holes pocking the walls like a disease. "They'll send the law," Caleb said, sitting heavily at the table. "Call it murder. Won't matter that we didn't start it. We defended ourselves. Won't matter." His jaw was tight. Not to men, who already decided what side they're on, before the shooting starts. Sanaya cleaned the wound on his arm. A deep graze, ugly but not deadly, wrapping it tight, with strips torn from a ruined shirt. "There's something else," she said quietly, not looking up from her work. "One of the men, before he went down, he said something." Caleb's eyes sharpened. "What?" Her hands stilled against the bandage, the memory surfacing sharp and unwelcome. She'd been reloading near the door when she found him, one of the wounded, dragging himself toward the yard, blood dark against the dirt. She hadn't meant to speak to him, but he'd looked up at her, eyes glassy with pain and something like disbelief, and the words had come out of him unprompted, like a confession he needed to make to someone before it was too late to matter. "Wasn't supposed to be a fight," he'd said. "Wasn't supposed to be nobody home to fight back. Voss said the store man told him exactly when you'd both be gone." She hadn't understood at first, hadn't wanted to. "Store man," she'd repeated. "Pruitt." He'd nodded or tried to, the movement costing him more than he had left to spend. Then his eyes had gone somewhere else, somewhere past her shoulder, and he hadn't said anything else at all. "He said Voss knew we'd be at the store today," she told Caleb now, keeping her voice steady, though the memory still turned her stomach. "Said someone in town told him our schedule, before we even rode out." Her hands stilled against the bandage. "Someone sold that information. He named Pruitt before he died." Caleb's face went very still. "Pruitt," he said, "not a question. He's the only one who knew we were coming for supplies." Sanaya's voice had gone flat, the way voices go, when anger has burned past its loud stage, into something colder, more permanent. "He must have sent word the moment we left the store, maybe before. Traded us for whatever debt Voss holds over him. Or worse, traded us for nothing more than staying on Voss's good side." She tied off the bandage, sat back. Either way, he knew, and he let it happen anyway. Caleb stared at the ruined door, jaw working, something hardening behind his eyes, that Sanaya hadn't seen there before. Not rage exactly. Something colder and more permanent than rage. "We can't stay," he said finally. "I know. Sheriff will come. Won't matter what happened here first. Won't matter that they came to kill us." He looked around the wrecked room, the home he'd built alone for 5 years, the walls that had held his grief, and now held bullet holes besides. "We run or we hang for defending our own lives." Sanaya reached across the table, took his hand, not romantic, not yet, just present, just solid. "Then we run," she said. "Together." They left before nightfall, packing what could be carried, leaving behind what couldn't. Sanaya moved through the wrecked house one last time, gathering what mattered most, into a single pack, a few clothes, what little food had survived the fire, the knife Caleb had given her. Her hand found the small woven basket on the windowsill, still intact despite the bullet holes pocking the wall around it, as if something had decided, in the middle of all that violence, to spare at least this one small thing. She tucked it carefully into her pack, wrapped in cloth, so it wouldn't crush against the ride ahead. Caleb watched her do it, something soft moving behind his tired eyes. "Didn't think that would survive the night." "Neither did I." She cinched the pack closed. "Felt wrong leaving it behind if it did." He nodded, understanding without needing more explanation than that, and turned to his own gathering, a few tools, what cash remained hidden beneath a loose floorboard, the deed to land they might never legally hold again once a murder warrant caught up with them. He paused longest over a small wooden box tucked in the back of the closet. Sanaya didn't ask what was inside. Some things a person needed to decide for themselves whether to carry or leave. He carried it, tucked it into his own pack, without a word, and she understood, watching him do it, that whatever it held mattered enough to risk the weight on a journey, where every extra pound might someday matter more than sentiment could afford. Caleb stood a long moment at the edge of the cottonwood stand, looking at two small crosses that had survived the fight untouched, as if even chaos had known enough to leave that ground alone. "I'm sorry," he said to them, quiet, private. "Didn't mean for it to come to this." Sanaya waited a respectful distance back, giving him whatever this moment needed to be. When he finally turned away, his face had settled into something grim and resolved, and he didn't look back again as they mounted up and rode north, away from Ironwood Flats, away from the only home he'd known in 5 years, away from graves that would now go untended by anyone at all. They rode through the night and into the next day, putting distance between themselves and everything that had just burned down around them, stopping only when the horses needed rest, pushing on when they didn't. The land changed as they traveled. Scrubland gave way to hills. Hills gave way, slowly, to something greener, colder, carrying the first sharp promise of a winter still weeks off, but already making itself known on the wind. On the second day, hunger caught up with them faster than either had planned for. The supplies from Pruitt's store, meant to last a season, had burned with everything else, and what little they'd grabbed on the way out wouldn't stretch far. Sanaya spotted the rabbit tracks first, crossing a game trail near a stand of aspen. She held up a hand, and Caleb went still without asking why, the same trust that had grown between them in small moments now paying out in this larger one. She moved low, quiet, the way her father had taught her, before she was old enough to remember not knowing how. Caleb watched from a distance, rifle ready but unused, letting her work the way she needed to work. Took the better part of an hour. When she finally returned to camp, 2 rabbits hung from her belt, and something in her posture had eased for the first time. Since the siege, not happiness exactly, but the particular satisfaction of a skill remembered. A body that still knew how to provide for itself even after everything that had tried to take that knowing away. "Where'd you learn that kind of patience?" Caleb asked, building the fire while she worked the meat. "You don't learn patience." She glanced up, something almost warm in her expression despite the exhaustion underneath it. "You survive long enough that it learns you instead." "That an old saying?" "My own, actually." A ghost of a smile. "Feel free to borrow it." "Might just do that." They ate in the gathering dark, the first real meal either of them had managed since the fire, and for a little while, sitting close to the small flame, with the smell of roasting meat filling the cold air, it was almost possible to forget what they were running from. Almost. The river found them the next morning, wider than either of them expected, swollen from rain somewhere upstream, moving fast and cold, and the color of old iron. Caleb studied the crossing a long moment, jaw tight. "Current's worse than it looks. We don't have a choice." "No, we don't." He looked at her. "Stay close to me. If the horse stumbles, let go of everything. But the reins. Supplies can be replaced. You can't." "Same goes for you." "Wasn't planning on stumbling." "Nobody plans on it. That's usually when it happens." He almost smiled, despite everything, despite the cold gray water rushing past them, wide and indifferent to whatever fear either of them carried into it. They crossed together, horses fighting the current, water rising past the stirrups, cold enough to steal the breath clean out of a person's chest. Halfway across, Sanaya's mare stumbled on a submerged stone, and for one heart-stopping second the whole world tilted sideways, water surging up toward her waist. Caleb was there, before she'd fully registered the danger. One hand closing hard around her arm, steadying both her and the horse through the worst of it, until solid footing returned beneath them. "Told you," she managed. Once they'd reached the far bank, breathless, soaked through, laughing despite everything in a way that surprised them both. Nobody plans on it. Duly noted. He was breathing hard too, water streaming from his coat, and for a moment standing there dripping and alive on the far bank of a river that could have taken either of them under. They were both laughing, the reckless, relieved laughter of two people who'd earned the right to it. They built a fire to dry out, and for a little while, sitting close to the flame, with wet clothes steaming in the cold air, it was almost possible to forget what they were running from. Almost. "You think Coyle's already looking for us?" Sanaya asked eventually, the question she'd been holding back finally finding its way out. "Probably." Caleb stared into the fire. "Question is whether he's looking to arrest us, or looking to understand what actually happened. Hoping it's the second. And if it's the first, then we deal with that when it finds us." He looked at her across the flame. "Same as we've dealt with everything else so far. Together. Together." The word had started to mean something specific between them, something neither of them had bothered naming yet, but both of them recognized whenever it passed between their mouths. They kept watch in shifts that night the way they had every night since the siege, but for the first time in days, sleep came easier, when it finally arrived, not peaceful exactly but earned. They found the trading post 4 days later, tucked into a fold of hills, where a thin stream widened enough to be worth building around. It was smaller than Ironwood Flats, rougher. A handful of buildings clustered loose around a well, smoke rising from 2 or 3 chimneys, the smell of wood smoke, and livestock hanging low in the cold air. They kept their heads down, bought what little they could afford with what money remained, and might have left, without incident if not for the old woman selling dried meat near the trading post steps. She was Apache, the first Sanaya had seen since the soldiers came. Sanaya stopped so suddenly that Caleb nearly walked into her. The old woman looked up, weathered face unreadable at first, eyes moving over Sanaya's face the way you study something you're not, yet sure is real. "You're one of us," the old woman said, quiet, not quite a question. Sanaya's throat closed. She managed a nod. "Which band?" Sanaya told her. Watched the old woman's face shift, recognition, sorrow, something that looked almost like relief all fighting for space at once. "I know that name," the old woman said, setting down the strip of meat she'd been working. "Knew a family from that band years back. Traded with them most seasons, before the soldiers made trading anything too dangerous to keep doing." She wiped her hands on her apron, held one out. "Nita, in case you're wondering who you're trusting with all this." "Sanaya." Nita nodded, like the name settled something. "Did you know Dakota?" The name came out of Sanaya, before she decided to ask it. Urgent, hungry. "My father." Tall. Scar through one eyebrow. Something crossed Nita's face, not recognition exactly. More like the careful weighing of a woman deciding how much truth a stranger's heart could hold in one sitting. "Name sounds familiar," she said finally. "Can't be certain. Many men carried scars like that, after everything this land's put people through." She studied Sanaya a moment longer. "You're looking for someone. I don't know who's left." Sanaya's voice cracked, just slightly, the words coming harder than she expected. "I don't even know if anyone is." "There's a group," Nita said, voice dropping lower, glancing once toward the trading post door before continuing. "North of here, up past the second ridge. Not many, a dozen, maybe less. Been hiding there since the soldiers came through, moving camp every few weeks so the army don't find them again." Sanaya's heart had gone very still, very loud, both at once. "Do you know who?" she managed. "Do you know any of their names?" Nita shook her head slowly. "Heard there's an older man leads them. Someone's uncle, someone's father. Don't know more than that. Rumors travel faster than truth out here." "Where?" Sanaya said, the word coming out rough. "Where exactly?" Nita studied her a long moment, weighing something. "You'll need someone who knows the trails," she said finally. "It's not safe country for someone traveling alone. Or traveling with trouble following them." Her eyes flicked, pointed, toward Caleb, standing a respectful distance back. "And trouble's clearly following you." She wouldn't say more. wrapped a small parcel of dried meat, pressed it into Sanaya's hands, without asking payment, and turned back to her stall like the conversation had never happened. Sanaya stood there a long moment, the parcel warm and small in her hands, her mind somewhere else entirely. Because it could be him, could actually be him. Her father's brother, her uncle, the man who used to carve small animals from cottonwood bark for her, when she was young enough to still believe wood could hold magic if you asked it kindly enough. Alive, maybe, somewhere north of a ridge she hadn't known existed an hour ago. "You all right?" Caleb asked, low, as they walked back to the horses. "I don't know." Her voice came out unsteady. "I don't know what I am right now." He didn't press, just walked beside her, close enough that she could feel his presence, without needing to lean on it, and let her carry the weight of the news in whatever way she needed to carry it. That night, camped a few miles beyond the trading post, Sanaya couldn't settle. She sat by the small fire long, after Caleb had gone still on his bedroll, turning Nita's words over and over, examining them from every angle the way she'd once examined tracks in the dirt, looking for the story hidden underneath the surface marks. An older man leads them. Someone's uncle, someone's father. Could be anyone. She knew that. Grief made a person want to see faces in clouds, want to hear familiar names in strangers' half-remembered rumors. She'd learned enough, these past weeks, not to trust hope blindly, except some part of her, some old and stubborn part, that had survived the soldiers, and the auction platform, and the burning barn, refused to let the possibility go quiet. Because what if, after everything, something of her family had survived the fire that took everything else? She pressed her palm against the small basket she'd woven back at the ranch, one of the few things she'd managed to grab before they fled, tucked now into her pack like something too precious to leave to chance. Her fingers found the familiar coils, the pattern her hands still remembered even in the dark. "This is how you talk to people who aren't in the room anymore," her mother used to say. She wondered, sitting there in the cold, whether that included people who might still be alive somewhere, waiting on the far side of a ridge she hadn't yet found the courage or the time to cross. Caleb stirred behind her. "Can't sleep?" "No." He sat up, rubbing at his eyes, then came to sit beside her at the fire, not saying anything for a while, just present, the way he always managed to be present, without demanding anything in return. "You're allowed to want both things," he said eventually. "Both things? Your family, and this fight." He looked at her, gray eyes steady in the firelight. "You don't have to choose between them just because the timing's cruel. Feels like I do. Doesn't mean you're right about that." He picked up a stick, turned it slowly in his hands. "I spent 5 years telling myself I had to choose between grieving Rachel and Mary and actually living. Turned out that was never a real choice either. Just fear dressed up as one." Sanaya considered that, the fire popping softly between them. "What if I go north and I'm too late?" she said. "What if they've moved on, or worse, and I spent this fight chasing a rumor instead of finishing what needs finishing here? Then you'll grieve that too, same as you've grieved everything else." His voice gentled. "But you won't know unless you try, and trying doesn't have to mean tonight." "When then?" "When Voss stops being a threat to anyone else who might cross his path." He met her eyes. "Finish this, then go north with a clear road behind you instead of one you're still watching, over your shoulder." She nodded slowly, her breathing evening out, not fully at peace, but steadier than it had been an hour ago. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not telling me what to choose. Just for making the choosing feel less impossible." He didn't answer that directly, just reached over briefly and let his hand rest against hers by the fire, not holding, just present. The same steady presence he'd offered, since the moment he cut the rope from her wrists. They sat like that a long while, the fire burning low, the northern hills waiting patient, and silent somewhere beyond the dark. The rider found them 2 days later, on a stretch of open trail with nowhere good to run, and no cover worth taking. He came alone. That was the first strange thing. A single man, badge catching the weak afternoon light, riding a horse pushed hard enough that lather streaked its flanks. Caleb's hand went to his rifle. Sanaya's followed a half-second behind. "Easy," the rider called, holding one hand up, empty, palm out. "Not here to shoot, here to talk." He pulled up 30 feet out. Didn't come closer. "Marshal Coyle," he said. "County's had a warrant out on you two for 4 days now. Murder. Arson." "We defended our home," Caleb said. "Don't much care what you call it." Coyle's voice had an edge to it that went beyond professional duty, something personal and raw underneath. "5 men are dead. One of them was my brother." The words landed heavy in the cold air. Sanaya's stomach dropped, because that explained the edge in his voice. The way his hand hovered near his belt like it wanted an excuse. "Which one?" she asked, quiet. Coyle's jaw tightened. "Young one." Scar through his eyebrow. "Wyatt." His voice caught, just slightly, on the name, and he seemed almost angry at himself for letting it show. 22 years old. Good with horses. Bad with money. Rode out that night because Silas Voss told him there was easy money in it, and Wyatt never once in his life could turn down easy money, no matter how many times I told him easy money always costs more than it looks like it will. He stopped himself, jaw working like he'd said more than he meant to. "He wasn't a bad kid," Coyle added, quieter now. "Just young. Just foolish in the way young men get foolish, thinking the world owes them something for showing up in it." Something cold settled in Sanaya's stomach, because she remembered that scar, that face, mocking her outside the store the day before the siege. Remembered, too, exactly whose hand had put him in the ground. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. That wouldn't make this worse. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said instead, and meant it, even knowing it would land wrong. "Don't." Coyle's jaw tightened further. "Don't you dare tell me you're sorry. You put a bullet in him." "We didn't know who any of them were," Caleb said. "They came at night, armed, torches lit. We were defending ourselves. My brother wasn't the kind of man who rides out at night for nothing." "No," Sanaya said, quiet, careful. "He rode out because Silas Voss paid him to." Coyle's face went still. "What did you say?" "Voss orchestrated the whole thing." Her voice steadied as she spoke, the shape of the truth clarifying even as she said it aloud for the first time. "It was never about me. It's about water, about land he wants and can't get through the courts, so he's trying to get it through fear instead. Your brother rode out that night because a man paid him to, and that man is still sitting safe on his own porch while you chase down the people who survived." "You're lying." "Am I?" She held his gaze steady, unflinching. "Ask yourself why Voss came himself that night. Ask yourself why a man who's ignored Caleb Hollis for 5 years suddenly cared enough to lead the charge personally. Ask yourself who benefits if Caleb hangs, and his land goes up for sale to settle the debt. That's a lot of asking and not a lot of proving." "Ask around town," Caleb said. "Ask who was paying for drinks the week before the first attack. Ask who suddenly had cash enough to buy silence from half the county. Men like Voss don't spend their own hands' loyalty for free. Somebody in that town saw the money change hands. You just have to be willing to hear it." Coyle's hand had drifted from his belt, not quite dropping the tension, but no longer quite so certain either. He sat his horse a long moment, the wind pulling at his coat, something working hard behind his eyes. "Even if that's true," he said, voice lower now, less certain, "doesn't change what happened, doesn't bring my brother back." "No," Caleb said, quiet. "It doesn't. Nothing will. I'm sorry for that. Truly." He paused, and when he spoke again his voice had steadied into something almost gentle. "But if you take us in on Voss's word, you're not getting justice for your brother. You're finishing the job Voss started. You'd be doing his killing for him a second time. Wyatt would have been just as dead either way, but at least right now, the truth about why he died still has a chance to matter." The silence that followed stretched long, cold, the wind moving through the empty trail between them. Coyle looked at his hands, at the badge on his chest, dull in the fading light. He came to me the week before, Coyle said suddenly, quiet, almost to himself. Wyatt did. Said a rancher was paying good money for men willing to ride at night. No questions asked. I told him to stay clear of it. Told him nothing good ever came from work a man wouldn't do in daylight. His jaw worked, something raw surfacing beneath the badge and the authority. He didn't listen. Said the money was too good to pass up. That's not your fault, Sanaya said, and this time her voice held none of the caution from before, just plain, unguarded sympathy. You warned him. He made his own choice. The man who made the offer is the one who should answer for where that choice led. I need more than your word, Coyle said finally, but the certainty had gone out of it, replaced by something closer to exhaustion. Then help us get it, Sanaya said. Help us prove what he did. Not for us, for your brother. So his death means something other than a lie Voss told to get land he wanted. Coyle didn't answer right away. He sat his horse a long moment, something working behind his eyes, that looked, for the first time, since he'd ridden up, less like a man hunting fugitives, and more like a man standing at the edge of a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to hold. I'm not letting you go, he said finally. Not yet. Not until I know for certain. Fair enough, Caleb said. But I'm not taking you in tonight either. Coyle's jaw tightened, some private battle settling behind his eyes. Give me something. Real proof. Not just words in the wind. You do that and maybe we talk about what happens next different than a rope. How do we find you? Sanaya asked. Once we have it. You don't. Coyle gathered his reins. I'll find you. Been tracking men longer than either of you have been running from something. Won't be hard. There was something almost like an apology in the way he said it. Not for the warrant, not for the threat still sitting underneath his words, but for the whole miserable shape of a situation that had cost him a brother and now demanded he trust the people who'd been standing over that brother's body when it happened. He wheeled his horse, started back the way he'd come, then paused, looking back over one shoulder. You've got until the next full moon, he said. After that, I stop being a man willing to listen and go back to being a man with a badge and a warrant. He rode off, leaving them alone on the empty trail, the sound of his horse fading into the wide, indifferent country around them. Sanaya let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands were shaking, she noticed distantly. Small tremors, the kind that came after danger had passed rather than during it, the body finally allowing itself to feel what it hadn't had time to feel, while the threat was still standing in front of her. Caleb noticed too, didn't say anything about it. Just reached over and took one of her hands between both of his, steady and warm, until the shaking eased. That could have gone worse, he said finally. It could have gone better. She looked down at their joined hands, then up at him. He could have shot us both on sight. Would have been well within his rights, warrant or no warrant. He didn't, though. No. She considered that, the strange mercy of it. Grief makes people do unpredictable things. Sometimes it makes them cruel. Sometimes it makes them listen when they'd rather not. Which do you think this was? I think he wants to believe his brother didn't die for nothing more than a stranger's greed. Her voice softened. That's not weakness. That's just what grief does to people, if you give it room enough to ask the harder questions instead of just the easy, angry ones. Caleb was quiet a moment, still holding her hand. You gave him that room, he said. Could have just as easily told him to go to hell. Wouldn't have blamed you. He lost someone too. She met his eyes. I know what that costs a person. Didn't seem right to make it cost him more than it already had, just because his grief showed up wearing a badge. She was quiet a moment, something heavier settling behind her eyes. I think I was the one who fired the shot that killed him, she said finally, voice barely above a whisper. The scarred one, from the store. I recognized him during the fight, right before She stopped, unable to finish it plainly. Caleb's expression softened, no judgment in it, only understanding. You didn't know who he was to anyone. Just a man with a gun trying to kill us both. Doesn't make it easier to hear his brother's voice break on his name. No, Caleb agreed. It doesn't. I don't think it's supposed to. He squeezed her hand once, gentle. But carrying that weight honestly is better than pretending it isn't there at all. You're allowed to grieve what this fight has cost, even the parts that cost the other side something too. Sanaya nodded slowly, the words settling somewhere deep, not healing the ache exactly, but giving it a place to rest that didn't feel like denial. They sat there a while longer, the cold afternoon settling around them, the weight of everything that had just happened slowly finding its place alongside everything that had already happened before it. Finally, Caleb released her hand, though something in the gesture felt less like letting go, and more like setting a foundation for whatever came next. So, he said. What now? She looked north, toward hills she couldn't see, yet but knew now were waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. Her uncle, maybe, and a dozen others who'd survived what she'd thought had taken everyone. I could ride north tonight, find them, disappear into those hills, and never look back at any of this. Caleb didn't say anything. Didn't try to talk her out of it. Just waited, the way he always waited, giving her room to find her own way to whatever she decided. But I'm not going to, she said finally. Not yet. Why not? She looked back the way they'd come, toward Ironwood Flats, toward 2 graves behind burned cottonwoods, toward a debt that had started 15 years before she was even born, and had somehow, impossibly, become hers to help finish paying. Because Voss doesn't get to win, she said. Not after everything he's taken. Not from you. Not from your marshal's brother. Not from anyone else he decides is standing between him and what he wants. That's not your fight. It stopped being just your fight the moment he tried to kill me to get to you. Her voice hardened, certainty settling into it like stone finding its footing. My people are still out there. They'll still be there next season. But this ends now or it never ends at all. Caleb studied her for a long moment, something moving behind his eyes that looked almost like awe, tangled up with something gentler and more frightened underneath it. You understand what finishing it means, he said quietly. Going back, finding proof, standing in front of a man who's already tried to kill you twice. I understand. And you're not afraid. I'm terrified. She said it plainly, without shame, the truth simple, and unadorned the way the truest things between them always seemed to be. But being afraid never once stopped my father from doing what needed doing. He taught me that fear and courage aren't opposites. They just happen to live in the same chest most of the time. Something in Caleb's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but close enough kin to one, that she recognized it now without needing to be told. Then we finish it, he said. Together. Together, she agreed. They sat by the fire while longer, the immediate danger of the marshal's visit fading, into the wider, harder question of what came next. Somewhere in that quiet, a plan began, unspoken at first, taking shape the way most of their understanding with each other had taken shape, not through grand declarations, but through small, deliberate pieces fitting themselves together one at a time. We'll need proof, Caleb said eventually. Real proof, not just a dying man's word, not just suspicion. Money trail, somebody Voss paid, somebody who kept a record, even if he didn't mean to. Sanaya's mind was already working the problem the way she used to work a hunt, looking for the path, the weak point, the place where a careful man's carefulness might have slipped just once. Men like Voss don't stay careful forever, not when they think they've already won. Pruitt might talk. If he thinks Voss is going to fall regardless, better to talk first than be caught standing beside him when he does. Or he protects himself by staying quiet and hoping we hang before we can prove anything. Then we make sure he understands which choice actually protects him. Caleb's jaw set, something steady and resolved settling over his features. Fear cuts both ways, if you're patient enough to use it right. Sanaya nodded slowly, watching the fire, watching the shape of a plan neither of them had fully seen. Yet but both of them, finally, believed in enough to chase. They turned their horses back south toward Ironwood Flats, toward a reckoning neither of them could yet fully see the shape of, but both of them, finally, walking toward instead of away from. Behind them, the northern hills sat quiet under a darkening sky, holding whatever they were holding, patient, unhurried, willing to wait a little longer for a woman, who had decided, for now, that some debts came, before even the deepest longing to go home. The ride back felt different from the ride out. Lighter, somehow, despite everything still waiting for them, the proof they didn't yet have, the man they had to somehow bring low, the town full of eyes that had already decided weeks ago exactly whose side they were standing on. Because for the first time since the platform, since the ropes, since every terrible thing that had happened between that morning and this one, Sanaya wasn't running from something. She was riding toward it, on her own choosing, beside a man who'd chosen over and over to stand exactly where she needed him to stand. That, she thought, watching the last light fade gold, and then gray over the hills behind them, was its own kind of freedom. Different from the one Caleb had handed her on that first terrible day outside Ironwood Flats. Harder one. More hers. Whatever waited for them at the end of this road, she intended to meet it standing, chin raised, exactly the way she'd stood on that platform when the whole world had first tried to decide her worth for her. This time, she intended to decide it herself. 2 days later, they crested the last ridge before Ironwood Flats came back into view, the town small and distant in the afternoon haze, no different from 1,000 other dusty settlements scattered across this hard country. Except it didn't feel like just another town anymore. Not to either of them. Caleb reined in beside her, both of them looking down at the place that had taken so much from him already, and now stood poised to take whatever remained. Vasa's spread is past the East Ridge, he said. Big house. More hands than a place his size ought to need. You've been there. Once. Years ago. Before he decided being neighborly wasn't worth his time. He studied the distant shape of it, barely visible even from this height. Man surrounds himself with people paid to agree with him. Makes it easy to forget anyone might eventually disagree back. Then we make sure he remembers. Caleb looked at her, something steady and certain passing between them, the same understanding that had carried them, through the siege, through the river, through every mile of hard road, that had led them back to this exact ridge overlooking this exact town. Together, he said. Together, she agreed. Below them, Ironwood Flats sat quiet in the fading light, unaware yet of the reckoning riding steadily toward its front door. Somewhere past the East Ridge, Silas Voss was going about his evening the way he always did, certain, comfortable, convinced the worst of his troubles had already ridden north, and wouldn't be troubling him again. He was wrong about that. Sanaya nudged her horse forward, down the long slope toward the town below, Caleb riding steady beside her, and neither of them looked back at the road that had brought them here. Her heart hammered anyway, the closer the street came into view. Because knowing you were right didn't stop a body from remembering what that same street had felt like weeks ago. Rope on her wrists, numbers called out like she was livestock, a whole town watching and doing nothing. Not this time, she told herself. This time you ride in standing. They weren't hiding now, and the town seemed to sense it. A few heads turning at windows, a wagon driver slowing to watch them pass. No one quite sure, yet what to make of two fugitives riding in at an easy walk, chins level like they'd never once considered turning back. They tied their horses outside the marshal's office. Coyle stepped out, before they'd even dismounted, hat low, badge catching the thin afternoon light. You're either very brave, he said, or very foolish riding in here in daylight. We need Pruitt, Caleb said. He's not going to talk. He will. Sanaya's voice stayed level, certain. Guilt doesn't keep quiet forever. It just waits for someone to finally ask the right question. Coyle studied her a long moment. Something in his face had shifted, since the trail, less suspicion now. More the look of a man who'd spent the past weeks turning evidence, over in his mind, and not liking where it kept landing. I've been asking around, he said quietly. Quiet questions. Careful ones. Enough to know you two aren't lying about the money changing hands. He fell into step beside them. Doesn't mean I trust you completely yet. Means I trust Voss even less. That's a start, Caleb said. It'll have to be. They walked the short distance to the store in silence, each of them turning over what came next. Sanaya's mind kept circling back to the ledger Pruitt had counted, so nervously through the window, the fear in his hands, the guilt already written plain across his face, before they'd even stepped inside. He'll try to lie first, she said quietly, before they reached the door. Men like him always do. Buys them time to decide how much of the truth they can survive telling. Then we don't give him time, Caleb said. We already know enough to corner him. Just need him to confirm what we already suspect. And if he doesn't, then we remind him what happens to men who stay loyal to someone who's never once been loyal back. Sanaya nodded, steadier now. They'd learned, these past weeks, how to move together this way, not needing every plan spoken aloud in full, just enough shared understanding to trust the other would meet them exactly, where the moment required. They found him in the back room of his own store, counting a ledger by lamplight, hands moving fast and nervous, like counting could somehow undo whatever debt had been sitting on his conscience for days now. He looked up, went pale. I already told Voss's men everything I know. We're not Voss's men, Coyle said, stepping into the doorway, filling it the way authority fills a room, without needing to raise its voice. And I've got 5 dead in the ground, and a warrant that's starting to smell wrong. Talk. I don't know anything. You know something. Sanaya stepped forward, her voice quiet but unyielding. You knew our schedule the day of the siege. You knew it because you sold it. That's not nothing, Pruitt. That's 5 men dead because of information you handed over for money. I didn't know they'd attack the house. I swear it. I thought. You thought what? Caleb's voice cut through, sharp as a blade. That handing a woman's life to a man like Voss came, with a clean conscience attached? Pruitt's hands shook against the ledger. He set it down like it had grown suddenly too heavy to hold. He'll kill me, he said, barely a whisper now. If I talk, he'll kill me. He'll kill you either way, Sanaya said quietly. Once he decides you're more useful dead than alive, the only question left is whether you die a coward, or die having done one honest thing. Pruitt's face crumpled, because that was the thing about men who'd spent years choosing comfort over conscience. Somewhere underneath the fear, there was always a small, exhausted part of them that wanted, more than anything, to finally put the weight down. He sank into the chair behind the counter, suddenly looking 20 years older than he had a moment before. 5 years ago, he said, voice cracking. The fever winter. Voss came to me, said there was a relief wagon coming through, medicine, doctors, headed for the settlements north and west of town. He swallowed hard. He paid me to reroute it. Said it was about a shipping contract. I didn't ask more than that. Didn't want to know more than that. Sanaya's chest went tight. North and west, she repeated, and her voice had gone very quiet, very still. That's where my people were camped that winter. Pruitt nodded, miserable. Wouldn't meet her eyes. And west of that, the Hollis homestead. The room seemed to tilt, because Caleb went white beside her, understanding arriving in his face like something physical, like a blow he hadn't seen coming even, though it had been coming for 5 years, patient, waiting for exactly this moment to finally land. Rachel, he said, just the name. Just that. Coyle's jaw had gone hard, as stone, listening, saying nothing, letting the confession run its course. The wagon never made it to either place, Pruitt said, unable to stop now, that the words had started spilling out of him. Voss didn't care who died. He just wanted both parcels of land empty by spring. Both of them sit over the same spring-fed water table, the one your fence line's been arguing over for 30 years, Hollis, and the one your people's winter camp sat right beside, without ever knowing how much it was worth to a man like him. He looked up, eyes wet, pleading for something none of them were prepared to give him. He'd been trying to buy both for years. Nobody would sell. Fever solved that problem for him. All he had to do was make sure the medicine that could have stopped it never showed up in time. Sanaya couldn't breathe, because it wasn't two tragedies anymore. It had never been two tragedies. It was one man, one decision, one winter and one greedy calculation that had reached into two entirely different lives, hers and Caleb's, and hollowed them both out from the same cruel root. She looked at Caleb. He looked back at her, something raw and unguarded passing between them, grief and rage, and something that looked almost like relief, the terrible relief of finally understanding a wound well enough to know exactly where to aim the healing. All this time, Caleb said, voice barely holding steady, I told myself it was just bad luck, just fever, just weather, just the world being cruel the way the world sometimes is for no reason at all. His hands had curled into fists at his sides. Wasn't luck, was a man's arithmetic. My daughter's life weighed against a strip of grazing land, and he decided the land was worth more. Mine too, Sanaya said, quiet. My mother, my brothers, weighed the same way, on the same scale. We should have hated each other, Caleb said, something breaking open in his voice. By his math, should have been on opposite sides of some line he drew, fighting each other over the scraps he left behind. Instead, we found each other. Sanaya reached for his hand, held it tight enough that neither of them could pretend the trembling in it belonged to only one of them. That's the one thing his arithmetic never accounted for. He built his whole plan on the assumption that grief would keep us apart, turn us into strangers or worse, into enemies. And instead it did the opposite. Her voice steadied, something fierce rising underneath the grief. It's the reason we ever met at all. Your bracelet, my father, all of it tangled together long before either of us understood why. Caleb pulled her close, and for a long moment neither of them said anything else, just stood there in the cramped back room of a dying man's store, holding on to each other the way you hold onto something solid in the middle of an earthquake. Coyle cleared his throat, gentle, giving them the moment before he had to end it. There's a ledger, Pruitt said, pulling a small book from beneath a loose floorboard, hands still shaking. Payments, dates, his signature, not just mine. Kept it. Told myself it was insurance. Truth is, I think some part of me always knew this day was coming. Coyle took it, flipped through pages that told, in cold, careful handwriting, the entire shape of what Silas Voss had done. This is enough, he said quietly. This is more than enough. Voss didn't run. That surprised Sanaya when Coyle and a half-dozen deputized men rode out to his sprawling house at dusk. She'd expected fear. Instead, Voss stood on his porch, unbothered, almost amused, like a man who still believed money could out-argue truth. This is absurd, he said. A shopkeeper's fevered confession and some old paperwork. Signed paperwork, Coyle said, holding up the ledger. Your hand. Your name. Dates that line up exactly with the week my brother died defending your greed for you. Something flickered behind Voss's eyes at that. Not quite guilt. Calculation, still working even now, looking for the angle that would let him walk away clean. Court will sort out what it means. Court will, Caleb said, stepping forward, voice low and hard as stone. But you should know something first. Voss's smile faltered, just slightly. My wife, Caleb said. My daughter. Her people. He nodded toward Sanaya, standing beside him, chin raised, unbroken. You didn't just take land from us. You took everything either of us had left to lose. And now every person in this town is going to know exactly whose hand did it. You have no proof any of that connects to me directly, Voss said, though his voice had thinned, the certainty starting to crack around the edges. A rerouted wagon. A shopkeeper too frightened to keep his story straight. We have a ledger with your signature, Sanaya said, stepping forward beside Caleb. We have a marshal whose brother died for your lies. We have a whole town who's been watching you long enough to already suspect what kind of man you are. All we needed was proof loud enough that they couldn't keep pretending not to know. Voss's certainty cracked, finally, visibly, the mask of a man who'd never once expected to be caught slipping for the first time in years. His eyes darted, once, toward the road, toward the horizon, toward some fantasy of escape, that evaporated the instant he counted the armed men surrounding his own porch. "I built this town," he said, quieter now, almost to himself. "You poisoned it," Coyle said. "There's a difference, and it's taken me too long to see it." They took him without a fight after that. Turned out certainty, once broken, didn't leave much fight behind it. Just a man, smaller than he'd ever looked, from a saddle, led away in the fading light, while the town he tried to own watched in a silence that felt, for the first time in years, like the beginning of something honest. Word spread through Ironwood Flats faster than any wildfire Sanaya had ever outrun. By the following morning, the whole town seemed to know, not just that Voss had been arrested, but why. A rerouted wagon, a fever winter, two families gutted by the same greedy hand. The older woman in the gray dress crossed the street to find her outside the general store. The same woman who'd nodded at her on auction day, who'd shaken her head in warning weeks later. "I remember that wagon not showing up," she said, not quite meeting Sanaya's eyes. "Was too afraid of Voss to ask why back then." "You're saying it now." Sanaya studied her a long moment. "That's not nothing." The woman's eyes went wet. She nodded once and walked on, some old weight visibly lighter for having finally set it down. Pruitt closed his store, within the week, and left before the trial. Nobody chased him. A man who told the truth, however late, however self-serving, had earned the mercy of disappearing rather than hanging for it. Voss's trial came, that autumn, swift and unambiguous once the ledger sat before the judge. Coyle testified first, laying out dates and payments and the shape of a conspiracy that had cost his own brother's life along with so many others. "You could have let the warrant stand," the judge said to him near the end. "Let two fugitives take the blame instead of a man, with money enough to make testifying against him difficult." "Could have," Coyle agreed. "Seemed like the least I owed my brother was making sure his death paid for something honest, even this late." The verdict came without much drama, the evidence too plain for any argument to survive it. Outside the courthouse after, Coyle found them in the thinning crowd, hat in his hands. "Wanted you to know," he said, awkward in a way that didn't suit a man used to giving orders. "This badge remembers who told the truth when it mattered." He tipped his hat and walked off, and Sanaya watched him go, understanding that some men, given enough grief and enough courage to look past it, could still choose to become better than the worst thing that had ever happened to them. The land, Voss's land, and the disputed water rights beneath it, reverted first to the county, then, over the better part of a year, back to the people it should never have been taken from. 3 weeks later, Sanaya rode north, with a guide Nita had finally trusted enough to send. The ride felt different from every other ride that had come before it. Not fleeing, not fighting, just going, finally, toward something instead of away from something else. Her chest tightened more with every mile, because hope was a dangerous thing to carry this far north, this close to an answer that might, after everything, still turn out to be nothing at all. What if it isn't him, she thought, the fear rising sharp and sudden. What if I've carried this hope 500 miles only to watch it die a second time? Except there was no way to know except to keep riding. So she did. The camp sat tucked in a fold of hills exactly where the rumors promised. Small, careful, a dozen fires, no more, smoke rising thin, into a sky gone soft with early evening. An older man stepped out to meet the riders, tall despite his years, a scar through one eyebrow catching the firelight. Sanaya's knees nearly gave out beneath her. "Uncle," she managed, just the one word. It was enough. He crossed the distance between them faster than a man his age should have been able to move, and when his arms closed around her, she finally let herself cry the way she hadn't let herself cry since the morning the soldiers came, not from grief this time. From something that felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, almost entirely like relief. We heard rumors, he said, voice rough, pulling back just far enough to study her face like he was checking it against a memory he'd been terrified of losing. A woman fighting a rancher's war in the South. Didn't dare hope it was you. Didn't dare hope for much of anything these past years. It was me, she said. Still me. Your mother, he started, then stopped, unable to finish the question. Sanaya shook her head, and he nodded slowly, absorbing it the way you absorb a wound you'd already half expected. He didn't ask about her brothers either. Some questions she understood now didn't need asking. The silence answered them plainly enough. But you're alive, he said finally, and that matters more than I have words for. He studied her a long moment, then looked past her shoulder too, where Caleb waited respectful, giving them their reunion the space it deserved. Nantan, she said, remembering herself, remembering Caleb standing there, without a name to put to the man holding her. This is Caleb Hollis. Caleb, my uncle Nantan. Nantan looked Caleb over, unhurried. The same weighing look Sanaya remembered, from childhood. The look that took its time deciding whether a person was worth trusting. That the rancher? He asked. That's him. He treat you well? Better than well. She wiped her eyes, something like a laugh breaking, through the tears. He bought my freedom and gave it right back. Took me a while to understand what kind of man does that. Nantan nodded slowly, something settling behind his weathered eyes. Your father would have liked him. He already did, Sanaya said. A long time, before either of us knew it. They built a home near Aspen Hollow that spring, close enough to the northern hills, that Nantan's small band could visit easy, far enough south, that winter wouldn't strand anyone between the two. The house went up slower than Caleb's first one had, but sturdier too, built with 4 hands instead of 2, with neighbors who finally showed up to help without being asked, the same neighbors who'd once turned their backs on Main Street, now hauling lumber and mixing mortar like the past few months had scrubbed something clean in them they hadn't known needed scrubbing. Sanaya taught, the way she'd once dreamed of teaching language, stories, the patient art of weaving reeds, into something whole. She started small, just a handful of Nantan's grandchildren gathered under a cottonwood, her voice finding the old rhythms of her mother's teaching, without her ever quite deciding to search for them. They simply came back, the way water finds the low ground it always belonged to. Word spread. Soon it wasn't just Nantan's people who came to listen. Settlers' children sat cross-legged in the dust too, wide-eyed, learning that the land they lived on held stories far older than anything written down in a ledger. Their mothers came at first only to watch over them, then stayed to listen themselves, and by the second summer, Sanaya's small gathering under the cottonwood had become something the whole valley simply called the teaching, without anyone deciding to name it that on purpose. Caleb rebuilt what needed rebuilding, this time with help he'd never once accepted before, neighbors who'd finally understood which side of history they wanted standing behind them. He kept the 2 small crosses from the old ranch, moved them careful and reverent to a quiet rise behind the new house, and some evenings Sanaya would find him out there, talking low, the same way he always had, except now she sometimes joined him, adding her own words in a language Rachel and Mary had never heard, but Caleb said he liked to think they were learning anyway, wherever they were. Nantan visited often, that first year watching the house rise, watching his niece build something steady out of a life that had once seemed entirely burned to the ground. He never fully warmed to Caleb the way Sanaya had hoped. Not at first, old wounds ran too deep for that kind of easy forgiveness. But he came to trust him, slowly, the way trust always seemed to grow in this family, through action rather than declaration, through years of small proofs stacked one on top of another, until doubt simply had nowhere left to stand. One evening, watching the sun go down gold, and easy over land, that finally truly felt like theirs, Caleb took her hand. I used to think surviving was the whole point, he said. Turns out it's just the beginning of it. What's the rest of it, then? Sanaya asked, watching the light catch gold in his tired, steady eyes. If surviving's only the start. He considered that a long moment, the way he considered everything careful and unhurried. Building something worth surviving for, he said finally. That's the part nobody warns you about. How much harder it is than just staying alive. And how much better. Sanaya laced her fingers, through his, watching smoke curl up thin, and blew from a dozen cook fires scattered across land nobody would ever again try to take from either of them. Then let's make sure the rest of it counts, she said. He didn't answer with words, just pulled her closer, and together they watched the light fade slow and gentle over a home built not on what they'd lost, but on everything they'd finally, fiercely, chosen to keep. Somewhere behind them, children's voices carried on the evening air, Apache words and English words tangled together, laughter that belonged to no single people, but to all of them now, gathered here by choice instead of chance. It wasn't the life either of them had once imagined for themselves. It was, they'd both come to agree, so much better than anything either of them had dared to imagine at all.